Welcome to the Jedi Ranger. I'm JohnBerry555, and today, I'm reviewing the entirety of the Star Wars Skywalker Saga, plus Rogue One and Solo Star Wars stories as well. So, all the live-action films to date. Yes, I still want to rewatch it and then do my review for the Star Wars The Clone Wars film, and also the Ewok movies, because why not? I think those were television specials, but still, eventually I will do those. Those will be in the next coming weeks. But I thought, let's actually take a look at the Skywalker Saga as a whole, plus the other two live-action films, because why not? Timestamps will be down below if you'd like to jump ahead, but this will be released in rough production order. Basically, it's going to be original trilogy, prequel trilogy, then sequel trilogy, though Rogue One is going to be with the original trilogy, and Solo is going to be between the sequels and prequels. Timestamps below if you want to understand how I get that arranged. But enjoy, and I hope to see you at the end for my overall conclusion. Welcome to the Jedi Ranger. I'm JohnBerry555, and for the past 4 Wednesdays, I've uploaded my reviews of Rogue One, A New Hope, The Empire Strikes Back, and Return of the Jedi. So today I thought I'd combine all those 4 reviews together before I move on to the prequel Star Wars films, so that way we can look at the combined story of the original trilogy. So we'll take a look at kind of each film individually, basically in the context of I'm doing this all post-Star Wars Andor, and then I'll give my overall original trilogy era films thoughts. But yes, Rogue One was not original trilogy in terms of production, but it is in terms of story, so it fits through. Solo is going to be the oddball in all this. Probably won't get into a compilation video until I do all the films together, but we got some time before we get to that. So in the meantime, let's go do these in chronological order rather than production order, because we're going to be starting with Rogue One, because that's how I filmed it. So production order for me, chronological order for in-universe. So enough yapping for me. Well, you get more yapping for me, but enough pre-yapping for me. Let's get into the actual reviews. Back in December of 2016, I made my first ever Star Wars review. That was for the film Rogue One, A Star Wars Story. Season 2 of Star Wars Andor has aired its final episodes. Andor is done for. I'm sad, but it does give me the opportunity to re-watch Rogue One with a new context in mind. This is the Jedi Ranger. I'm JohnBerry555, and this is my new improved review of Rogue One, A Star Wars Story. If you would like, you can go watch my original review, but I think this one's going to be a little more polished. And this one's going to be in the context of Star Wars Andor Season 2. And the first thing I would like to express is how Andor Season 2 is designed to lead into Rogue One. There's a line from, I believe, Moff Tarkin to Director Krennic talking about security leaks. We only see one leak in Rogue One, and that being Jyn Erso giving a message to Bodhi to give to Saw that eventually, roundabout way, finds its way to the rebellion. But in Andor, we see additional leaks. Lonnie giving the information about the Death Star to Lucen, who then gives it to Claire, who then gives it to Andor, who then together gives it to the Rebel Alliance. Information is leaking, and that's part of what Tarkin is using to justify taking control of the Death Star. It's also why Vader, but with a dad joke, mind you, do not choke on your aspirations, basically tells Director Krennic to get his act together and maybe you won't be killed. And that includes, sealing all those security leaks. But of course, those leaks are out. The Death Star is out, and the Rebel Alliance finds out about it. There's many individual moments here and there. One thing I would like to mention is there's a scene where Cassian tells Jyn that he is not the one she has to convince. He's referring to the Rebel Alliance Council, and as we see later in Rogue One that, she does not do a good job at convincing them. Mon Mothma and Bail Organa and Admiral Raddus are ready to take the fight to the Empire. They know it's coming, but the rest of the council is not ready yet and is unwilling to take action. And that's what leads to Jyn, Baze, Chirrut, Cassian, Melshi, and many other rebels decide to take action, and then Mon Mothma, Bail Organa, and Admiral Raddus also decide to take action against the Council. The Rebel Alliance rebels against itself to defeat the Death Star. That is essentially what happens. But all that advice Cassian gives to Jyn is first-hand experience of his own issues getting the Rebel Alliance Council to take his own intel seriously. Intel about the Death Star, mind you. But what I really want to show, though, is that they establish why Cassian knows the Rebel Alliance Council is not going to act, because the proof is not strong enough. So I have a feeling, even if Jyn had grabbed the message from her father that Saul had, I still think a few of the members of the Rebel Alliance would be like, yeah, nope, not going to do anything about it. I still think there's a good chance that is to happen. But Rogue One is a story about rebels, and as I mentioned, rebels rebel, and they rebel against themselves in order to fight the Empire. But there's another thing before we get to scales that I would like to talk about. When Jyn and Cassian first meet Chirrut, that very much, rewatching that scene, it called back to when Cassian met the Force Healer on Yavin in Season 2 of Andor. Both times he's unsettled. Cassian, with that Force Healer, is basically confronted with his destiny. A destiny that he's not really in control of. He's also referred to as a messenger, I believe, by the Force Healer. And that's what him and Jyn do at the very end. They send a message hoping somebody would listen. But he's unsettled by all that in Andor. He's also unsettled by Chirrut. He knows Chirrut is a member of the Guardians' Wills, but he also, I think, recognizes that Chirrut seems to have some connection to the Force, something that I think unnerves Cassian. And Chirrut, sensing Jyn's necklace, even though she has it covered, and sensing maybe something about her destiny, unnerves Cassian. I really love that character consistency between Cassian, though at the end of the story, he does embrace his destiny. He does not run from his destiny. But one thing with all that is that Cassian very much, it's not because he's running from his destiny or willing to embrace it, it's because he knows that's the right thing to do. There's also a scene where Cassian tells Jyn that rebellions are built on hope. That scene, of course, was in Rogue One, and somebody apparently said to Tony Gilroy that it sounded like that Cassian was repeating it rather than really believing it. And that's why he included the bellhop at the hotel on Gorman to say that to Cassian right before the Gorman massacre, that rebellions are built on hope. And I think it's fitting that Cassian learns to trust in hope, learns to essentially trust in the Force. Just like how in Rogue One, Chirrut, he trusts in the Force till the end, and then Baze, seeing Chirrut trust in the Force and accomplish an impossible task, comes to believe in the Force once again and trust in it, and is able to take out all the Death Troopers on the beach. Yes, he sacrificed himself in the process, but everyone in the Rogue One, that team, knew it was going to be a sacrificial mission. But they hoped that their sacrifice, their actions, were going to win the day. And in a sense, you can trace that all the way to a young bellhop on Gorman who inspired Cassian in the moment that he needed its inspiration. But we can also trace that back all the way to Nemec and his manifesto, who I think truly inspired Cassian to dedicate his life to the rebellion, dedicate his life to ending tyranny and bringing freedoms back to the galaxy. I think that very much is what Cassian's doing. Yes, the Force has set him on a destiny, but he's also doing the right thing because it is the right thing. Yes, he's not trying to subvert the will of the Force, but he's not necessarily embracing it either. And I think that's very much fitting in how we see Cassian in Rogue One. He's doing the right thing to defeat the Empire because it is the right thing, not because of anything regarding destiny, regarding the Force. I also like to think that Luke Skywalker, even if the Force never brought R2-D2 and C-3PO to him, never had him, meet Obi-Wan Kenobi and learn his potential as a Jedi, I still like to think Luke would have eventually found his way to the rebellion. But that's more of a side tangent there, as the heart of Rogue One is a story about people, regular people, doing what they can to fight tyranny. And that's also the story of Star Wars Andor. And when you look at them together and then also bring in Star Wars A New Hope, you're seeing individual pieces achieving a collective goal, but not like cogs in the machine like the Empire where everyone's replaceable. Every member of the Rebel Alliance means something. Yes, maybe the role, their job can be replaced, but they personally cannot be replaced. Their sacrifices mean something. They accomplish things with their sacrifice. Every member of the Rogue One team accomplished something to defeat the Empire. Be it distracting the Empire just long enough, taking out a single stormtrooper, what gives? They all did their part. They weren't cogs. They were not links in a chain, though I do kind of like that metaphor. I prefer seeing them as runners in a relay race. They each have a baton, and they do something to pass that baton to the next person. And that baton passing, well, you can talk about when that began. You could look at Revenge of the Sith and that first baton being the Force warning Yoda about the oncoming of Order 66, or Obi-Wan getting lucky with his Force thanks to the Force. Or, if just in the context of Andor, Rogue One, and A New Hope, just look at 2 children being saved, and 3 adults doing the saving, plus 1 of them being saved. Marva and Clem saving Cassian on Kenari, and Lucen saving Kayla. I can never get her name right, I'm sorry. Or her saving Lucen at the same time. But that is, in terms of the story being told by Andor, Rogue One, and A New Hope, because they all lead into each other, those are where the batons begin. But each character has their own baton. Nemec has his baton with his manifesto, which just spreads to the point where even diehard Imperials who are fully ingrained in the Empire, fully believe in it, are still being impacted, both maybe in a subtle way, but perhaps in a way like realizing his time, major progress, his time as a cog in the machine is done, and he has only one action left. Well, he has 2 choices, but he chooses the only action that he gets to dictate. That's his choice, his freedom. It's his own subconscious making that choice for him, the choice that he can make. Yes, he could have made a different choice, but it would have been his choice. And he doesn't even realize that Nemec's manifesto got to him. That's what I'm saying there. But Nemec's manifesto is one of those batons. How many members of the Rebel Alliance, how many members of Rogue One's team heard Nemec's manifesto, and the reason why they volunteered was because of Nemec just saying, try to do something, hope you're going to succeed. How many members of the Rogue One's team are there because of Nemec? We don't know. Cassian, definitely, but we just don't know. And that's what's so great about how all 3 of those stories connect up together. They're all leading into each other and building off of each other. And while the themes do change, they're not inconsistent, they're staying put. And it's all about resisting tyranny, about fighting against fascism, authoritarianism, and tyranny. That's the story of Star Wars, and that's the dedicated story of Star Wars Andor and Rogue One and A New Hope. They all just go about it in different ways. And then of course there's the whole thing about Scarif, which is just a great scene as a whole. Really just great to see the first proper battle in Star Wars. Yes, we saw a little bit of Endor and of Yavin and of Hoth, but not like what we get to see on Scarif. And the reason why is, in Empire Strikes Back, Hoth is just a set dressing, a delaying action. In Universe it was definitely a delaying action, but what impact does the battle have on the story, the character development for Luke, for Leia, for Han? Not that much. How much, story-wise, do the Battle of Endor have on for Luke? Not too much. Yes, his friends are getting slaughtered by the Empire, but it's window dressing, literally in Luke's case. And for Leia, she's just continuing to fight. It doesn't really feel like those are the stakes, but they're not moving the individual character stories going on, but we do get that with Scarif. Each individual rebel gets their own moment, especially Baze and Chirrut. They get some great moments on the beach, but Baze especially because he regains his trust in the Force because of Chirrut's actions in the battle. We get them all making choices to advance the field. And each fighter pilot that the rebels bring, they all make those choices. And all of those choices, especially for our main characters, tells us something about them. Choices they're making in the battle that are impacting their characters. The other battles, they're great. They have their great moments. Luke's turning the targeting computer off in A New Hope. Perfect character development. Leia basically, using her wound to basically get the drop on two stormtroopers in the Battle of Endor. Perfect as well. Tells us a bunch we need to know about who she is as a character. And definitely helps Han realize that he likes her. But in terms of saying something greater, I don't feel like they do as much, nor do so as realistically. And that's what Rogue One is. It's the real battle of the rebellion. You have those stakes. We don't get, except for really seeing one Ewok mourning the death of another Ewok, we don't feel the stakes in the battle, the personal loss in the battle. But we do for Scarif. We really get that with Baze and Chirrut, but all the characters, like many of the characters, we get a moment focusing on them after they pass. We get to see Melchi. Yeah, man, he went so far. And I teared up watching it because I knew what was going to happen to all these characters. But characters like Meshi, who we hadn't seen before until Andor, we get to see his backstory like, oh, wouldn't it be great if he could continue fighting for the rebels, continue living, thriving, and so many more. But we knew how the story is going to end. It's tragic. And that's the thing is, there's different kinds of suspense. But what Rogue One does with its suspense, because we knew everyone before, and especially in the rewatch, that no one's really coming out alive among our main characters. But they achieve suspense in the emotions, getting us to feel something, feel connected to the main characters. And that's where Rogue One thrives, because you tear up because you care about these characters. They don't feel like larger-than-life heroes. They feel like real heroes who gave the ultimate sacrifice to save everyone else they cared about, and in the hopes that things will be better. And because of Star Wars being an established property, we know things do get better. But that still doesn't mean we don't care about these people and feel sad when they pass in the universe. There's more I can talk about, I'm sure. I talked 45 plus minutes with my original Rogue One review, but with this review, I think I'm going to cut it shorter because I've said the most important things. And if you want to talk about other aspects of the movie, we can. And we can do so in the comment section down below. So I would love to hear your thoughts on what I had to say and about Rogue One as well, and how it connects into the rest of Star Wars, especially Star Wars Andor. I would love to hear your thoughts in the comment section down below. Welcome to the Jedi Ranger. I'm JohnBerry555, and I'm finally reviewing Star Wars Episode 4, A New Hope. You think I would have talked about the film by now, and actually, technically, I have. Because I did a one change to each Star Wars film and a 3 reasons why each Star Wars film is not the worst YouTube short series. So I did talk about this film, but I've never done a proper review of A New Hope. And considering just last week I did a re-review of Rogue One following the completion of Star Wars Andor, I figure it's time to get into the rest of the Star Wars films. And we might as well begin with the film that began it all in 1977. Star Wars, and that's what it's called. It was literally just called Star Wars back then. Though George Lucas has renamed it to Star Wars Episode 4, A New Hope. And also a special edition. Unfortunately, I have yet to really see the original theatrical cut, but I do have a version that's extremely close on VHS. Unfortunately, I did not watch that version. I just watched the version that was on Disney+. So, to begin with, I want to address one thing. The scene with Han talking with Jabba is not needed. That scene really is not needed. Everything that was in the Greedo scene was included there. So we don't need both scenes, one or the other. And I think the Greedo scene is better because Han shot first. No matter how the editing may make it look, Han shot first. Additionally, I do think the scene where Red Leader says that he knew Luke's father should have been kept in. That should not have been removed after the theatrical release. Mainly because I think it's fine. It's fine that people know who Anakin Skywalker was, that he was a Jedi. It's just that they are not supposed to know that he became Darth Vader. That's the thing that people don't know. So it's fine if people know who Luke's father actually is, as in Anakin Skywalker. And also, the scene with Biggs would have been nice if, Luke somehow mentioned Biggs earlier. The deleted scene with him is not necessary, but would be nice to kind of set that up maybe a little bit better. But those are nitpicks, because really, this is a great film. And it started out, had to have been great. But as we know, George Lucas was not necessarily optimistic about its reception, but turns out we loved it. And it's still a really solid film, even despite the special edition and the changes that George Lucas have made to it. Despite that, it's still a very solid film. I will say, if you only exposure to Star Wars so far had been Andor and Rogue One, you'd be like, who are these characters? What do they have to do with the characters we saw before? Yeah, we saw Princess Leia at the end of Rogue One, but who's this Luke guy? Who's this Ben Kenobi guy? Who's this Darth? Oh wait, Darth Vader's that guy in that hallway scene. Okay, you would not have context for a lot of these characters, but I got to say one thing. Because of Rogue One, Leia is flat off lying in front of Darth Vader, who, unbeknownst to either one of them, they're related. Neither one of them know that at this time. But seriously, she just basically ran away from Scarif with the plans, and she said she has the gall. And I have to say, it's quite brave, confident of her, the gall, to basically flat out lie in front of Darth Vader, the Emperor's enforcer, and say, yeah, I don't know what you're talking about, I'm just on a diplomatic mission. And he literally witnessed what's going on. It makes that scene just all the more badass, for lack of a better term, really. Additionally, Rogue One and Star Wars Andor put the event that we see in A New Hope into even more context. We obviously knew that to a certain extent. A lot of the base stuff we needed to know was covered in the crawl. But an important context is Leia's decision to return to Yavin knowing the Empire is tracking them despite Han's dismissiveness. She knows how the rebellion basically won't act unless forced to, and so she forces them to actually confront the Death Star. And also, too, it's the wise choice to not put any additional systems at risk. Very smart on her part. I also have to say, when she tells Tarkin that as the Empire continues to tighten its grip, that most systems will slip through the cracks, that very much reminds me of a lot of the sentiment echoed in Star Wars Andor with Namek, with Lucid, the idea of as the Empire tightens its grip, people will start to feel the pressure. It won't be like a frog in a pot that's slowly boiling. It'll be like a frog that's in a pot slowly boiling and jumping out when it realizes it's getting too hot. Very, very clever there, and I really did like how basically the sequels, but not the sequels, if you know what I mean, basically put a lot of this stuff into additional context. But of course, the story of Star Wars A New Hope is not just the political story that is given additional context in Rogue One and Andor. It's also very much a character story, mainly for Luke and Han. Leia does not get too much character development in this film, but Han and Luke, yeah. Han, well, he kind of still is a bit selfish at the end, but he does come around. He does realize that, yeah, he probably should help the rebellion out to defeat the Empire. Basically, he starts going for the money, and then he ends up making the right choice anyhow, without considering the reward or anything like that. I also like to think Chewbacca told him, hey, this would be the right thing to do. You should do the right thing. And Han deep down knows it's the right thing and listens to Chewbacca. But that's just my little fan theory there. But Luke, his story, his character development is more on display. He wants, to seek adventure and all that, and he does get his adventure. Yes, he loses his mentor, but he meets new friends along the way, and basically comes out a hero. He goes from basically a know-nothing. He basically goes from a nobody farmer to hero of the rebellion. And yes, in Star Wars, he's from the son of Anakin Skywalker, the chosen one, yada yada. But that was not George Lucas's final intention when he was making the film. That's something that came out later on as he further developed his story and made the other movies. And really, Luke was just a farm boy who was seeking adventure just like his father and had a chance to find adventure, and not just find adventure, but go on a journey to help others. There's a scene where Leia asks Han if anything matters to him besides money, if he actually cares for anyone besides himself, and Luke truly says, I care, showing that he, one, a contrast between him and Han at that stage in their character development, but also showing that Luke, I would say, him being a hero, he never sought out to be a hero. But he was a hero because that was the right thing to do, because he cared about others. At least that's how I interpret that scene. But there is one more thing I want to discuss before I end my review. That being the final award ceremony. So when George Lucas was making A New Hope, he had no idea that he would, in 3 years, be releasing The Empire Strikes Back. So this ending of A New Hope, the ending of Star Wars, was made to be a capstone. The heroes of the Battle Yavin are honored. Now, I will have to say, why didn't Wedge get a medal? Why didn't the Y-Wing pilot too? There's two different ones in Legends and Canon. They have different versions, but why didn't he in Legends and she in Canon get a medal? Why didn't Chewbacca get a medal? Well, later Star Wars stories have answered some of those questions. Chewbacca got a medal in a private ceremony, and it's revealed that Wookiees don't put stock into physical medals, which I really liked how they decided to justify Chewbacca not getting a medal by saying it's his culture, and it shows that the rebels value his culture and respect his cultural beliefs and practices. I really love that in retrospect, but it would be nice if maybe in the film. But here's a good headcanon for like why we didn't see Wedge and some of the others. Easy. Han and Luke and Chewie, they were at the back of the line, and they were waiting for their moment to enter. Because they were the final ones. That's my theory, at least. Because the idea of award ceremony, probably more than one rebel who was honored, but they got the ending honor. But that's just a little headcanon theory thing going on, though. But really, the point of that scene is showing that the rebels are triumphant, that the Empire is defeated. Yes, the Empire strikes back later on, but we didn't know that when this movie came out. We did not. And therefore, because there was no firm intention to make a second movie, George Lucas had to have it end on a satisfying final victory note, so that way we, the audience, would be satisfied. And that is what he accomplished. And to end out my review, I just have to say, Star Wars A New Hope, it's not the first Star Wars film I saw, but it is the quintessential Star Wars film. It has the messages of trusting in the Force. It has the message of being a good person makes you a hero. It has the message that evil can and will be defeated, but will commit atrocities until it is defeated, and you have to stand up against it. There's more we can talk about, but that's what the comment section is there for. So let's keep the discussion going. Welcome to the Jedi Ranger. I'm JohnBerry555, and I'm reviewing Star Wars Episode 5, The Empire Strikes Back. So while I have talked about The Empire Strikes Back before in some YouTube shorts and in comments when talking about other Star Wars projects, I've never really talked about it truly in its own right in a full-length review. And that's true actually for most of the Star Wars films, so I am correcting that. Last week, I reviewed The New Hope, and before that, Rogue One. This week is going to be Empire Strikes Back, and next week is going to be Return of the Jedi, so stay tuned. But let's really dive into the film and discuss it. So, probably the most important thing to get out of the way first is that the original trilogy was not created with a cohesive narrative. Did George Lucas have things in mind? Yes. But he did not sit down, write out 3 movies, and then produce one every 3 years. No, that's more of the the prequel trilogy. But still, despite that not being planned, despite what a lot of Star Wars fans want to think, the ideas in this film do follow logically from the previous film. The Death Star is defeated, but the war is not over. The Empire is going to seek its revenge. Now, from expanded material, we know it's been 3 years, but in the context of the film, it could be anywhere from a month later to, well, maybe not a decade later, but a couple years later. And we've set it in the universe, canon and legends, I believe, are being about 3 years in universe time. And we get to see, the Rebellion growing. There's not really growing, but think of this. In A New Hope, the only rebel ships we see are some fighters. At the end, in this movie, in Empire Strikes Back, on Hoth we get to see some transports, and then we get to see, at the end of the film, the biggest rebel ship we have ever seen at this point. Now, yes, timeline-wise, bigger ships have been seen before, but in terms of what was shown on screen first, we've seen the biggest ship now, which we've now known to be the Nebulon B frigate. So there's that sense of scale there. We've also seen now the second biggest Imperial ship, too, with the Executor or Executor. I always like saying Execute. Some people like Executor. Regardless, that's a huge debate in the fandom that just like, is it Tantive or Tantive V? But that sense of scales with ships is actually something that Star Wars does really nicely. Introduce one ship, then introduce an even bigger ship, and then introduce an even bigger ship. And we do kind of get that. No, we saw how big the Death Star was because we saw how big the Star Destroyer was in relationship to the Tantive 4. And here, well, we see how big the Executor is because we see a Star Destroyer, which we have context from its size from the previous film. So, and the reason why I'm bringing all this stuff up is to show how through visual language alone and background story details that are not maybe directly impacting the main plot, we are still getting a sense of time, of scale, of the different background factions, which all help create a real feeling world. But let's really take a look at the main plots. We have Luke Skywalker's story where he's basically training to be a Jedi, then confronting Vader and learning a horrible truth. And then we have Han and Leia's story, which is the love story of the film. Now, is it the best love story ever told in Star Wars? Probably not. Better than Anakin and Padme? Definitely. Maybe because it's not as toxic. It has its issues, mind you. There's a reason why they're separated in the sequel trilogy. But it's mostly because Han's a bit of a free spirit and, probably doesn't want to admit the better side of himself. So, he's still with the Rebel Alliance after 3 years. He hasn't gone back to pay off his debt to Jabba, and actually that does catch up to him in this film. But that was also they did in outside the universe in case Han Solo's actor Harrison Ford will not return for another film. But that is more of a side point to what the story being between the two. And that's basically Leia coming to realize that she does have feelings for Han, and Han learning to be maybe a bit more vulnerable with his own feelings and maybe be a bit more honest. Yes, when Leia tells him, "I love you," he says, "I know," and that's very much a Han Solo way of doing it. It fits his character perfectly, but it's also been him being more vulnerable. All throughout this film, basically he's hinting that Leia finds him attractive, but he doesn't find her attractive. But the truth is, he always did. And he just couldn't admit it until that end, when she also admits it because she couldn't admit it to herself. And that's the main storyline going there. Could it be better told? I think so. And I think the comics and books do help explain and flesh it out a bit better. And Star Wars does definitely have better romances. Star Wars Jedi Survivor is one good example of that. But the point I did want to emphasize there is how in that story, it, like I said, it could be better. I think very much 80s in the storytelling, so it doesn't really give, a few sweet gestures here and there, that's all you need. Not quite proper build-up, but like I said, it's more cringy in retrospect, but still I think way better handled than the toxic mess as Anakin and Padme's, mostly because of Anakin. But going back to Luke Skywalker, his story mainly revolves around him being a Jedi. He crashes on Dagobah and meets Yoda, now realizing Yoda is being impatient, that gets Yoda concerned, yada yada. And Ben Kenobi's Force Ghost talks Yoda into, yes, giving Luke a chance, and Yoda trains Luke, and then Luke gets a vision of the future and goes off and ends up confronting Darth Vader. And is he ready for it? Not really. Luke loses. He survives, but he loses. But he only survives because Vader was never intending to kill Luke, only capture him and turn him to the dark side. And when capturing fails, Vader reveals the horrible truth that he is Luke's father. And what I really like about that scene is Luke denies it, and Vader tells Luke to search his feelings, it would be true. That's very much echoing what Palpatine tells Vader when Palpatine says that the offspring of Anakin Skywalker is alive. Now, Vader, we know from the comics, already knew this, but the point I want to emphasize there is that a little bit of a parallel there, that this familial relationship is being revealed via the Force, essentially, and the individual trusting the Force and sensing the truth. Now, we know from expanded material that Palpatine knows Vader and Anakin are one and the same. Vader knows that, obviously, and Luke learns it in this film, but the way it's presented in this film implies that Palpatine, the Emperor, Darth Sidious, doesn't know Anakin and Darth Vader are one and the same. Obviously not, but that's the way it was presented. I think it would have been an interesting story opportunity to actually have gone down that route. But it still, while they didn't do that, the way they did do it works very much because Palpatine doesn't want Vader to associate with Luke Skywalker, with Anakin Skywalker at all, due to the threat of him remembering who he used to be. Still wasn't the best person, but definitely a much better person, let's put it that way. But with all that being said, overall, it's a great film. There's a reason why The Empire Strikes Back is ranked as the number 1 or number 2 Star Wars film by most fans, myself included, is because it has a solid story. It divides our heroes up in a way that contributes to their own character developments and helps us learn more about their characters. And it just has some great background stuff as well. The Tauntaun stop motion, well, yes, probably a bit dated in terms of technical feats. At the time, I'm sure it looks stunning, and even now, it still looks pretty good. Though I gotta admit, when I'm watching on my DVD copy or on my VHS, I notice it being stop motion a lot less, but watching on Disney Plus is much more apparent. But that I attribute to just more of how with modern technology they can clean up a lot of stuff, so things that were once hidden due to film grain that are becoming a little more noticeable to modern audiences, especially if you're aware of the specific filming techniques that were used in order to create the film. Another great thing from a filmmaking perspective is the crawl. Now, all Star Wars saga films have used the crawl, but it's a great way of getting some exposition and setting up the story without interrupting the narrative, because it begins at the beginning, it's exciting, it makes it feel grand, and it sets things up. And what little exposition they needed to do in Empire Strikes Back, it all feels organic. You have a Force vision, you have a character revealing a deep dark secret, you have a military briefing. Those are all natural in the world and thus don't feel out of place. A New Hope had to do a little more traditional expositions, but that was partially because not only were we new to the world then, but so was Luke Skywalker. He was taking his step into that greater world and he needed to learn about it. And he got that from his mentor giving him advice. And that is done in a way that fits into the narrative, fits into the story, and not interrupts the flow. Interrupting the flow would be if we opened up the film with a rebel describing the events that happened to another rebel, or a recap. I'm not a big fan of the recaps that are done on the Disney Plus TV shows. I feel like that hurts the story. The announcements that they did at the beginning of the Clone Wars episodes were a great way of doing it because it fit in, it helped. It didn't seem as out of place, if you will. But that's another factor, another story for another video. But what I really want to get in is that I do think of the original trilogy, I think of most Star Wars films, I think The Empire Strikes Back is the most technically soundly made film. The pieces come together well. It just fits itself and is very well made. Yes, other films are exceptionally well made as well, but I do think The Empire Strikes Back is the best made of all the Star Wars films. And there's more I can discuss. I can talk more about small character moments, about Lando, who I haven't even talked about, and his little arc there, his own little way of trying to protect his people, trying to be responsible, if you believe it. And in the end, he decides, he gets to a point where there's only one thing to protect the people. Speak the truth, tell them to flee before the Empire takes full control. And man, does that remind me very much of Mon Mothma, and she got to a point where she had to speak the truth and full on rebel against the Empire in order to protect the people of the galaxy. And that is kind of fitting there, and that is my little connection to Star Wars and with this film. It's a small connection, mind you, but it's a neat, thematic, and I think fairly important connection that helps shows our characters and shows that Lando is more responsible than Han. Han stays because he likes adventure and he's deep down a good person at heart. Lando does the right thing because he exhausts all other opportunities to keep his people, to keep the people of Cloud City safe from the Empire. And that is where I want to end this review. There's more I can discuss. I can discuss how Leia kisses her brother, but they didn't know that at the time. And that ending shot is just gorgeous. Them overlooking that. I think it's supposed to be it's debated, is there like a star forming in the galaxy, another galaxy? There's a bit of debate there, but that interstellar formation and then the panning out and we get to see basically a map painting them. It's just gorgeous, and yes, it makes our heroes small as we pan out, but we see that they're part of this greater rebellion, which we've seen before. But here, like I mentioned at the beginning with the scale of the ships and how we've finally seen the biggest rebel ship we've seen so far, by making our heroes feel small in this big rebel ship, it shows the rebels are growing in their strength in their community and fighting the Empire. And that's that nice parallel there to what I mentioned earlier and everything that we saw in Andor, though Andor was made after all this. And because of that, this is retrospective things that we can apply that was not initially intended when the show was made. That's a long roundabout way to say Star Wars is good, The Empire Strikes Back is good. Let me know your thoughts in the comment section down below. Welcome to the Jedi Ranger. I'm JohnBerry555, and today I'm going to be reviewing Star Wars Episode 6, Return of the Jedi. So if you haven't seen it, I have been rewatching and re-reviewing all the Star Wars films. I started with Rogue One after completing Star Wars Andor, and I continued with the original trilogy from there. And now we are at Return of the Jedi. So this Star Wars film is actually quite special to me. This is actually the first Star Wars film I ever got to see. So you can imagine there's some stuff that was spoiled for me by the time I actually watched the rest of the Star Wars films that were out at the time. And also, something like, oh, okay, whatever, because I like the context, like, why was it, a big deal that Vader was Luke's father besides the fact that they were on opposing sides of a galactic conflict? And a lot of the stuff like that, I just didn't have the context for. But you know what? I got hooked on Star Wars and I've been a fan ever since. But let's really take a look at the film in different parts. First, let's address probably the biggest elephant in the room. And what's that, you may ask? That's going to be the special edition changes. So there's really, I would say, 1, 2, 3, 4 changes, 2 in the Jabba's Palace and 2 at the end that I want to discuss. In Jabba's Palace, they actually, as I understand it, refilmed some of the scenes specifically for the character Ola, for dancing and all that, and visiting Jabba going down to the Rancor pit. As I understand, they refilmed some of those scenes to expand it in. That stuff is perfect, you can hardly tell. But it's the musical stuff going on that changes. They, I believe, changed the song and introducing CGI characters that have not held up very well, at least on my screen. That's Slice Noodles, who I never liked as a character. Even her appearance in the Clone Wars, I did not like. Her design is alien in a way that does not seem like it. it's not a good alien design in my opinion. And I just don't like it. The CGI on Hoser holds up better. It's that other kind of almost cockroach-like creature that his CGI does not hold up well at all. And it does kind of take you out of the moment, both those things. The music itself is actually not too bad. It's just the CGI they use doing that sequence is not great. And then the ending of the film, they changed Yub Yub to the victory celebration. And I really do like that change. Yub Yub was fine, but victory celebration seems bigger in scale and puts the rebellion into a wider context. By showing other planets besides Endor celebrating the defeat of the Emperor, it tells us, the audience, that the rebellion was not isolated. They were a big galaxy-wide movement. It has more impact, I think, on the story and more of a sense of finality to the rebels' victory. Yes, we know both in canon legends the war did continue and all that, but that's more of a side point. The point is that at this point, it's showing that the Empire's time was over. On Palpatine's homeworld of Naboo, people were celebrating. Gungan clearly says Misa free, which is, for the Gungans, they've been kind of struggling for a long time for, their freedoms and all that. Things had started to improve, but things went south once the Empire took control. You had, Tatooine, which probably not as oppressed as some other worlds, definitely was feeling the boot of the Imperial Stormtrooper, as we saw in A New Hope. So we got celebrations there. We get to see Coruscant, and of course this was after the prequels when that change, I believe, was made. But that you got people celebrating on the capital of the Empire, including, if you pay attention, there's a stormtrooper that's being carried by the crowd and likely to be thrown off a ledge. In fact, if I remember correctly, in Star Wars Return of the Jedi, from a certain point of view, Dexter Jettster's story, I believe, actually addresses that and how he tried to save the stormtrooper because, very much more of, hey, we defeat them, we don't need to punch them any farther kind of mentality. I don't know if he actually succeeds in that. But the point I want to get there is not only like on Coruscant, where it's likely more than just a celebration, but a popular uprising, showing that the Empire is defeated. Not only was the super weapon and the Emperor killed, but people were rising up. Really great way of book ending and showing that the fight against the tyranny, or authoritarianism, and fascism of the Empire was defeated, and that they were done for. There was no way they could recover. And going back to the song itself, the song itself is more, I would say, almost melancholy. It's still a celebration, but you can definitely tell, like, we defeated the Empire, but no, we had costs, we had sacrifices. There's more of a melancholy to it. Well, Yub Yub, it was great and all, or even compared to how A New Hope ended, the celebration seemed more triumphant, not that sense of melancholy, because yes, Vader was redeemed, but he had no chance to act on his redemption besides saving Luke. We have several other things as well, people who were lost and all that. And so those are just things that I feel like Victory Celebration emotionally conveys better than Yub Yub had ever done. Of course, that is not all. And thanks to Star Wars Rebels, a very popular fan series came about that Captain Rex was the old rebel on Endor. While Forces of Destiny did kind of go that route, my headcanon is that the character from Legends, Nick Sant, who is basically a parody of St. Nicholas in terms of naming, and Rex are two separate characters who joke that they look vaguely similar to each other, and that they were both for Endor, but they were having different missions, that Rex's mission was more after the fact, bringing reinforcements down to help mop up the remaining Imperial forces on the planet. That's my headcanon there, but that's actually a great thing about Star Wars in general, is we do name a lot of background characters, but sometimes we don't, and sometimes we do in such a way that we can create fun headcanons, like how we got fake Wedge in The New Hope because of some interesting behind-the-scenes casting things, which I think was phenomenal, and I wish they would do that same thing with Nick Sant and with Captain Rex, because I just love that kind of funness there in the storytelling. But we really should be talking about the actual film. I've spent over 7 minutes now talking about changes and all that kind of stuff, and not the actual story of the film. And so I really want you to focus on Luke Skywalker. His story here is about him becoming a Jedi. The film is called Return of the Jedi after all. And the first thing I want you to focus on in that is Luke throughout most of the film is wearing an all-black tunic. And for me, that is symbolizing the darkness that's inside of Luke, but also the darkness that is surrounding him, that is the threat, the conflict that he needs to overcome, the obstacle, in order to actually become a Jedi. And then we have Yoda's line to Luke that in order to become a Jedi, he must confront Vader, confront his father. Luke did need to convince Yoda to confirm that Vader is Luke's father. But I do want you to take a note and point out that the film uses the word confront. Not fight, not defeat, confront. Which I think is kind of telling. I think in both Obi-Wan and in Yoda's mind, that was confront as in fight a duel with Vader and defeat him. But the Force, the true confrontation for Luke to become a Jedi is to confront Vader and resist the pull of the dark side while also drawing Vader back to the light, drawing Anakin Skywalker back. That's Luke confronting Vader, confronting the dark side, and he overcame it. He did not succumb to it, did not let it control him. Now, and then to symbolize that visually to us, the audience, Luke Skywalker, after that duel, his tunic is partially pulled back, revealing the white interior. The light is now peeking through. And yes, in both Legends and in canon, Luke still struggled with the dark side, and the dark side was not fully defeated after confronting Vader and the Emperor. However, in my judgment, that's a minor thing, because especially when George Lucas was making Return of the Jedi, the story was about Luke confronting the dark side and resisting it, not about him defeating the dark side once and for all. Yes, the dark side will always be defeated. That is the ultimate message of Star Wars. The sequels do reiterate that, and also so do many stories in Legends. But for this story itself, Anakin, he doesn't need to be the chosen one. He chooses to save his son. That's why, that's what redeems him. He chooses the path of love and compassion rather than hate and fear in that moment. He chooses to save someone. That's the Jedi thing. And while, yes, attachments are brought up vaguely in the original trilogy when talking about the Jedi, not like they were in the prequel trilogy. And that's partially because the story being told is a different story. The sequel is focused on the fall. Here it's focusing on someone becoming a Jedi, and that involves, being compassionate and saving others, but also maybe recognizing when is the right time to save others. Han, Leia, Chewie, they were all been fine no matter what happened in The Empire Strikes Back. Luke did not need to be there to save them. They saved him, thankfully. Well, Lando, because Han was in carbonite. But the point I'm trying to emphasize here is that when you look at the story being told, we don't need to concern that what happens next. All we need to be concerned about is Luke faced the dark side and remained in the light and became a Jedi for it, while also redeeming his father, confronting Vader, and finding the true Jedi outcome. Something the Jedi of the prequels have lost sight of for various reasons, and we'll probably talk about that in a later video. But there is more to discuss. We also have Han and Leia's story, so continuing their romance, which, while not as apparent in terms of the narrative as it was in The Empire Strikes Back, here I feel was done much better. That I partially chalk up to the fact that they already set up that they have romantic feelings for each other, so now it just needs to be cemented. And what I really liked how they did that is during the Battle of Endor, Leia does get a grazing wound on her shoulder, and Han's taking a look at it, and two Imperial troopers come up, and Han can tell her that Leia has her blaster ready to go, and Han says, "I love you," because seeing that, very much his thing to do. And Leia responds, "I know," and then shoots the stormtroopers. That's not, the shooting stormtroopers part is not necessarily the romantic part, but the fact that it's rhyming with with Leia's confession of her love to Han from Empire Strikes Back, and this time it's Han properly confessing it himself. And that's why both of them said, I know, in their different circumstances. I think that is beautiful and very great poetry and shows that they do very much know each other. And then later on, Leia does tell Han that Luke is Leia's sister because they needed to clear that up because Han was a little bit jealous right there. Hey, but now, eventually in timeline, both Kanan and Legends will have a Jedi as his brother-in-law, so there's that. There's also the murder teddy bears, the Ewoks, and I gotta say, they were going to eat our heroes. They were. And if not for basically Luke force levitating C-3PO, it would have happened. And we learn actually more context from a certain point of view of why the Ewoks are reverent to C-3PO, because he vaguely resembles one of the gods known as the Golden One. And that's just some additional context the books bring in, but it's a very fun context to bring in. And honestly, the Ewoks there, they're brutal to the Empire. I caught this time on my watch through. They literally, during one of the scenes were beating up stormtroopers, they cracked the stormtroopers' armor, which, yes, for filming purposes, I'm pretty sure was made of plastic, but in universe is plastoid, which is like a super sturdy plastic that it can block, projectiles. Don't get on the wrong side of Ewoks, since they can break something that apparently projectiles can't break. Yeah, they're brutal. And not to mention, at the end, during Victory Celebration, they're drumming on stormtrooper helmets. What happened to the stormtroopers? What happened to the Imperials? They probably tried to eat them. At least in Forces of Destiny, Leia did stop some stormtroopers from getting eaten by giving Ewoks rations, but could she have stopped them all? I'm not so sure. And yeah, some war souvenirs too from fallen troopers and all that. But I guarantee you, the Ewoks would have eaten the Imperials. And they probably did. Do not get on the Ewoks' bad side. Do not. And the Ewok Hunt battle mode, game mode in Star Wars Battlefront 2 is brutal. I literally played it last night and I was the second to last stormtrooper surviving. I don't know how. I was running along the perimeter of the map. I think that's the only reason why. I kept on moving. The stormtroopers lost the Ewoks won, which is a good thing, but they were scary. And that mode is hard because, yeah, the Ewoks have the advantage there. But I bring all this up to say, Ewoks, people make fun of them. Do not make fun of them. I love how especially more recent stories are leaning into the fact that they're basically murderous teddy bears. Go for that. I love it. But before I end my review, I do want to address another thing as well. I vaguely touched on Vader's redemption, but I want to emphasize, Vader's redemption was not because he destroyed the Sith, fulfilling some chosen one prophecy which may have been misread. Let's remember that. But he was redeemed. He was brought back to life because he chose compassion. He chose not to be a slave to the darkness anymore and chose to save his son. The only person alive who believed that there was still good in him, who believed he could turn from the dark side and redeem himself, which is very much also like Padme. And I think that there is what's the true important thing, is that two people in Anakin's life believed there was still good in him. And if those two people didn't, especially with Luke, because he actually got Vader redeemed, Anakin would have died as Darth Vader, not become Anakin Skywalker once again. Now, we can get into, is Anakin and Vader one person or two people, split personality type thing? Vader thinks so, Palpatine wants to think so, and Obi-Wan Kenobi definitely thinks so, but Padme doesn't, Luke doesn't, I don't think Yoda does as well. My personal headcanon is that Vader, Anakin, is trying to separate the Anakin who should have always been from Vader, from the darkness, the Anakin that became Vader. And actually, Force Ghost Anakin is that Anakin who never experienced the dark side. Yes, he has those memories and all that, as we can actually see in his appearance in Ahsoka, but especially in the context of Return of the Jedi, that is Anakin if he was never corrupted by the dark side, never had Palpatine whispering in his ear. he would have been probably still very reckless at times and probably still willing to push the line. But some of his more authoritarian fascistic tendencies that we saw in the prequels before he became Vader would likely be because of Palpatine whispering in his ear, corrupting him. This is not like a serious situation. This is a slightly different situation because he's a different character and has a different role in said story. And I think a big part of that is Vader was corrupted. Anakin was corrupted into Vader. Still one person, but trying to disassociate and create almost that split personality. But Anakin was always in there. The Anakin who was always supposed to be was still in there. And in that personality that was always in him, finally gained the strength to act to save his son, to save Luke from the Emperor. And that there is why Vader was redeemed in the narrative. Because he made the right choice. Not because of destiny, not because of anything, but because his inner goodness took action. It finally said, enough was enough, we have to do the right thing, we're not going to let fear control us anymore. And he wins and gets redeemed. But those are just my thoughts on all of this. There's a lot more to discuss about Return of the Jedi, so the comment section down below will be open, so let's continue discussion on there. So now that we took a look at the 3 original trilogy films plus Rogue One, let's take a look at the whole picture. So first I do want to address, which I alluded to in my intro, that Rogue One production-wise was made way later. What am I doing there? Let's just move on from that little word vomit hiccup. But Rogue One was made production-wise much later than the 3 original trilogy films, and that does show in some of the filmmaking techniques. Now, I did watch the special editions that are as being shown on Disney Plus, not the original theatrical cuts. So, to say that I had no CGI in the original trilogy would be false, but the original trilogy was made before CGI. And when you compare the use of CGI in the original trilogy to Rogue One, you do see a stark contrast, and that's because a lot of the CGI of the original trilogy special editions have not survived very well. Some of them have, I will say. I know CGI was used to open up Cloud City in Empire Strikes Back, and for a lot of stuff in the Victory Celebration scenes at the end of Return of the Jedi. Those held up pretty well, but a lot of it just did not hold up. There's that one creature that you see on Tatooine before you see the cantina, and there's a stark contrast between that, honestly not very well holding up CGI compared to the practical costumes that were used in the cantina scene. And then you go to Rogue One, where I honestly, except for using the CGI to basically deep fake Grand Moff Tarkin and Princess Leia, not really deep fake because this was actually before deep fake technology, it holds up. That's the only stuff I know is CGI because I know it's CGI because I've been told it was publicized as that stuff was going to be CGI. The ships I also know are CGI as well because I was told that. And the thing is that because I know that stuff is CGI, that's the only reason why I know it. Because some of that stuff, minus the people stuff, holds up very well that in Rogue One, I can't tell the difference. And that's because I feel like in Rogue One, they were not trying to show off the CGI. I feel like when you're trying to show off CGI, it holds up worse. And I think that's what's going on with a lot of the CGI in the original trilogy special editions. George Lucas is trying to show off, look what we can do with CGI. And it doesn't hold up. And when compared to Rogue One, much more recent, so better CGI technology, the stuff that they wanted to show off being CGI is the stuff that you notice being CGI the most. And I did discuss in my review a little bit about the Uncanny Valley, where Moff Tarkin's reflections look perfect, but himself at times the CGI became apparent. And that there I think is the key. When you're trying to show off how good your CGI is, you I think almost think like, oh, we're going to be past the Uncanny Valley. But people know, and therefore the Uncanny Valley effect comes in. Even when it's a totally alien design. the uncanny valley can still be a thing that impacts how you view. Now, I will also say, while a lot of the practical effects do hold up in the original trilogy, not all do. I kind of pointed out that some of the stop motion effects in The Empire Strikes Back just did not hold up as well as they could have. But at the same time, there's a lot more practical effects that did hold up perfectly well, and I did not even notice because they held up well. And I think no matter whether you do CGI or practical effects or some other form of or even in-camera effects as well, no matter what kind of special effects you're using, the more you're, I think, trying to show off your special effects, the more likely I think it is that they are going to not hold up well. Basically, what I'm saying is if you're like, hey, look at this cool effect, whether it's practical or CGI, it doesn't matter. People are drawn to that being an effect and are going to be more critical of it. Therefore, they're going to be more likely to see the faults, see the problems with it. But when you're not trying to draw people's attention to it, it blends in much better. And that's my theory what's going on there. But that's not even getting into the story. That's just getting into the effects making part of the movies. When it comes to the story itself, the Rogue One, despite being a separate film from the original trilogy, is very much a connected in that part of the story. It is, you could say, a bit disjointed because you follow different characters, but that happens when you have, many movies and many stories going on at once in a shared universe. But the thing is, Rogue One, a big part of the movie is passing things, is especially near the end, was, passing things. The Rogue One team passed the plans to the rebels on the ship, who then literally passed it to additional rebels, eventually getting it to Princess Leia. And that there, I think, is, I don't know if it was intentional or not, but very much symbolizes this fight against the Empire. The story that is being told in Rogue One is being passed from the Rogue One team to the original trilogy characters. And especially when you factor in Star Wars Andor, you could see that very much. The end of Rogue One is passing from Cassian and his team fighting the Empire to Luke, Leia, and Han fighting the Empire in terms of stories. So that there fits very nicely. And also just when you do a Rogue One and A New Hope in isolation, they very much flow right into each other. While the themes may change a little bit and how things are told may change, there is that consistent storyline of we are fighting the Empire, we are fighting tyranny to create a better galaxy. That's the storyline pretty much throughout all those stories. And I'm including Star Wars Andor in this. Fighting for a better tomorrow. Sometimes it does take time for characters to realize why they are fighting. Cassian has that. Luke needed his own call to action. Leia's like the only one who didn't need a call to action in the entire thing. I believe her call to action is handled in the book Leia, Princess of Alderaan, which I have not yet read, which I really should read. But I say all this to convey to you that the original trilogy is considered the gold standard for Star Wars storytelling for a reason, and the way Rogue One and by extension Andor have built into it has made a much more, I think, cohesive story, a much better picture on why the Empire is being fought and how potentially, even though it was never said, how our characters in the original trilogy may have been influenced in subtle ways by the Rogue One team, by Cassian Andor and his story and everyone he connected with. In fact, in the comics, the reason why Rogue Squadron was created by Luke Skywalker was to honor Rogue One. I really love that, and I kind of wish they've done more with that, which I don't really think they have. But that's more of a story outside of the original trilogy thing, though, not in the original trilogy itself. But I do bring that all up to show that I really just enjoy this era of Star Wars, and I really love how despite these stories being made at different times, not really planned together, all do create a good cohesive narrative because all the creators generally had the same two things in mind: a creative passion, and they know what they wanted to say about resisting authoritarianism and tyranny. While it's much more overt in Andor than it ever was in the original trilogy, those same themes are present, and it just fits nicely. Now, resisting evil is more how they frame it in the original trilogy, But isn't tyranny just evil made manifest in the world? That's at least how I'm going to look at it for the nature of this review. But those are just my thoughts on Rogue One and the original trilogy. Let me know your thoughts in the comment section down below. Welcome to the Jedi Ranger. I'm JohnBerry555, and if you're wondering, I've been doing a series of videos where I've been rewatching and either making a brand new review or re-reviewing each Star Wars film depending on if I had reviewed them previously or not. Well, I've finished all three prequel films, so it's time to take a look at them together. Now, I do want to real quickly address that Solo Star Wars story, while being a prequel, doesn't fit into the stories of the prequel trilogy, so I'm not doing it there. And the animated film for the Star Wars The Clone Wars, which did actually get a theatrical, though limited, release, won't also be included in here, though I did consider including it, but I decided that is going to be best served by being its own separate thing, so that's going to be the week after this video, so stay tuned. But in the meantime, let's first recap each individual film and my thought on them before I discuss them as a unit. And might as well start with Episode 1, The Phantom Menace. So to begin with, let's address probably the elephant in the room. Most people rank The Phantom Menace as the worst Star Wars film. Well, people didn't until they decided just to hate on whatever the newest film is going to be, which I definitely think is a thing that they do, but we're going to talk about The Phantom Menace is typically considered one of the lowest films. But actually, what I'm going to be doing next week is what I consider the worst of the prequel trilogy and probably my least favorite Star Wars film overall. But with that said, I do understand where they're coming from. Some of the CGI I think doesn't hold up very well. And Jar Jar, well, his future appearances in the Clone Wars and Attack of the Clones, Revenge of the Sith, and external in other media like books and that, I think portray him much better. The Clone Wars still lean into more of his goofy and clumsiness like the Phantom Menace did, but it seems like they did a better job at conveying that to us, the audience, and making it feel more endearing than annoying. Jar Jar, I can understand why rewatching this film, like, yeah, some of his clumsiness gets over the top and it gets repetitive. So eventually comes to a point where you're just rolling your eyes at it because it's not really funny slapstick humor anymore. Also, I can't believe they did a fart joke in this movie. I did not remember that. I must have been blocking it out. I hate those kinds of jokes because they're low-hanging fruit, to put it easily. But with all that said, there's another factor that I think a lot of people complain about with the Phantom Menace. The fact that it is set so far off in terms of time jump-wise from Attack of the Clones. And you know what? That is somewhat valid. I don't think it's that much of a problem because it doesn't really impact the story, but, you know, maybe if it was done differently, you know, age Anakin up from 9 to like 11 or 12, and the jump would have been about the same as the jump between the first movie, which I don't know why I was blaming there, but between Episode 4 and Episode 5, which was about a 3-year jump, aging Anakin up 2 years would make the jump about the same. And actually, I do kind of wish Anakin was a bit older so that way him and Padme are a bit closer in age. But it's only like a 5-year age difference, and I don't think Padme started having any feelings toward Anakin until later in life, but we'll talk about that in the next film. But with all that said, I still think The Phantom Menace is actually a pretty decent film. It's enjoyable. Yes, there's some of the humor doesn't hold up that well, but I think the drama does pretty good. Suspense, action, all that stuff I think holds up pretty good, minus some of poorly aged special effects. And by the way, there's a lot more practical effects than computer effects in this film than a lot of people remember. Just wanted to point that out though. But I really do want to convey that it's the comedy in this film that doesn't hold up well. Okay, lots of people still laugh at fart jokes, and I just don't like party humor. I just don't. It's not for me. But it's all in the humor is where this film falls, not in anything else. Drama, suspense, like I mentioned, action, all do a really good job. I also love some of the parallels as well between this film and the other Star Wars films. Like, for example, in the ending scene, we get to see Anakin, then we see R2, then we cut to Padme, and she smiles just like Leia smiled after the scene in Star Wars: A New Hope, in the celebration scene where all of our main characters look over at R2 and C-3PO. Like, there's some callback there as well, and that's just a neat little touch there that I really appreciate that they did. I picked it up this time because I hadn't picked it up before, but it's that subtle thing that I just really like. Another subtle thing is one of the speeders in Mos Espa looks almost identical to Luke's speeder, just with a different paint job. It's a fun little Easter egg though, no bearing on the story, but it is fun. But let's actually discuss what I really like about the film. The sound design. That's often some of the best stuff, especially with the music and all that. Duel of the Fates, of course, is very spectacular. It provides a perfect backdrop to the duel between Anakin and Qui-Gon. I don't know what I was doing there. Between Obi-Wan and Qui-Gon versus Darth Maul. And intercut with the scenes of the Battle of Naboo. I honestly think it's very well done. I remember with it was one of the looks, special looks from after the Mandalorian, I think it was, I think some behind the scenes look on Disney Plus where Filoni gets his take on Duel of the Fates and how it's basically the outcome of that fate determined the direction that Anakin's life would go. Does Obi-Wan survive or does Qui-Gon survive? And you could, I think, make the sound argument that Qui-Gon probably would have been able to steal Anakin away from the dark side because, if nothing else, even if Obi-Wan still trained him, because Qui-Gon would be that father figure in Anakin's life that Anakin needed. He would not have been going to Palpatine to get that father figure. And notice too, may I mention how literally Palpatine tells Anakin that he'll watch his career with great interest. Like, you don't say that to a child, Sheev. You just don't. I fully like the parallels where basically Palpatine's grooming Anakin to become a Darksider. I think that fits very well with his evilness and all of that. But, like, you don't say that. And I do think Anakin missing his mother. Obi-Wan was more his brother. Literally, that's reinforced in Revenge of the Sith. We'll get there eventually in the Clone Wars as well. So Anakin never really had a parental figure. He loses his mother, then he loses his mother in the next film. And a father figure was provided for him by Palpatine that Palpatine decided to take advantage of. Qui-Gon could have been that father figure for him. And that's how I look at that. You may have different interpretations, but Duel of the Fates is literally Duel of Anakin's fate. Plus, just the entire track alone is entirely stunning. John Williams has so many great Star Wars scores, and honestly, some of the best things about all the Star Wars films is John Williams' music, and this film is no different. There's other small things to discuss as well, but I think I'll conclude the review with that this film, I think a lot of people don't give it a fair chance. That the comedy, the humor that surrounds Jar Jar Binks and the admittedly poor writing thereof to color their view of the rest of the film. Jar Jar stuff, besides connecting up with the Gungans, does not really have a large impact on the plot. He's not yet a character that's affecting decisions, and all that because of who he is as a character. A Gungan just reconning and bringing the Jedi to the Gungans would have done the exact same thing in terms of plot, and could have still come to the Jedi because, this Trade Federation stuff could be problematic. I better keep my eye on it. They could have done that and it would have worked. Jar Jar is now relevant to the plot as who he is as a character into the next film. And I bring that up just to show that Jar Jar in this film, people judge him and then judge the film because of him, and not actually look at the film beyond Jar Jar. And I want to ask you guys to consider that as well. But let's actually talk about Attack of the Clones. So for me, this is actually probably my least favorite Star Wars film as a whole, and definitely my least favorite in the prequel trilogy. Part of that is because there are so many red flags about Anakin shown in this film. I'm like, how come Padme is totally fine with that? This very smart senator, totally fine. Is it really that she thinks I can fix him? Because that's the only thing that makes sense. And red flags. Murdering a bunch of Tusken Raiders, staring at her. Okay, being awkward itself is not a red flag, but when you're, awkward and staring, even after she says, you're making me uncomfortable, and just a bunch of other stuff, it's like, how do you fall in love? It's like, I feel like the movie should have done a better job at portraying Anakin's positive qualities. Like, there's a scene where, they had pretty much just recently re-met, and here he is complaining about Obi-Wan Kenobi. That's very immature. There's another scene, too, where basically Anakin, however, is basically saying that he doesn't mind the dictatorship. And, I feel like that should also be a red flag as well. But no, it's not. And that's my biggest problem, is, I don't see how Padme would be interested in Anakin. I do get the other way around, totally, but not that way. One, Anakin is portrayed as a young teenager, not an 18, 19-year-old as he actually is. And I do think their age gap should have been a bit closer. But that goes back to just my whole thing with there was a 5-year gap when they first met, and now a 5-year gap would be semi-okay, but again, I feel like some of this stuff could have been portrayed a lot better and in a way that would have made it much more understandable. In fact, that's what I really like about the Clone Wars as a show, was because you got to see why they, are actually into each other. And yes, they also show why eventually the relationship does, essentially fall apart. But I feel like here, George Lucas could have laid the groundwork for all that a little bit better. He done the perfect groundwork for showing why, Anakin is not really a great person in the long run, but not good enough in terms of setting up why Padme would be interested in such a person, besides the I can fix him mentality. But besides that, the rest of the film is actually pretty solid. There's some cut scenes that I kind of wish they included, such as Obi-Wan going to the droids in the temple to try to identify the Camino and Saber Dot, because as it is now, he just goes straight to Dexter Jettster and says the droids couldn't say anything. And I feel like, not so great there, but hey, it still flows. What we'll need is told to us, but I do kind of like, more show versus tell in my storytelling. And as a part of that too, there's also a cutscene where basically Obi-Wan is briefly reflecting on Count Dooku, which I think would have been a great way to give maybe more insight into his character. But I can tell you one thing I really love, though, is the fact that when Obi-Wan goes to Master Yoda about not being able to find Camino, Yoda's teaching a class and he says, lost a parent Obi-Wan has. Or it might be Master Kenobi, but how embarrassing. And I just love that. That mischievous side of Yoda that we really got to see a little bit in Empire Strikes Back. And I just love it when that comes to be shown on the screen. Just reminds us about that, and I love that. Also, can I say something? Everyone in the Order knows what's going on between Anakin and Padme. I know this is a common headcanon, people like doing comics and YouTube videos making fun of that, but come on. Literally in this film, after the duel with Count Dooku, Padme runs up to Anakin and gives him a kiss with Obi-Wan and Yoda standing right there and a bunch of clones. Yes, the clones are probably not gossiping yet at this point, but come on, they will be gossiping. Everyone will know by the end of the war. I'm just saying. But there's several other things we can discuss. Small things here and there, but overall, I don't mind the film. It's just my least favorite because of how uncomfortable the romance is, and yes, there should be some uncomfortableness, but I feel like there's not enough positiveness in that to properly show why Anakin and Padme got together. Padme is portrayed as this, mature, as a go-getter. Like, literally, there's a scene where her security basically says, I'm not worried about Anakin, I'm worried about the senator doing something reckless. But the thing is while it could be reckless what some of the stuff Padme does, she's mature. Basically her security is being overly worried. But with Anakin, he is immature. He'll make mistakes, do courses of action based solely on how he feels in the moment, and he won't take a moment to step back and evaluate the entire situation. Like going to rescue Obi-Wan. Padme does it because no one will be able to get there in time to rescue Obi-Wan. And she evaluates the situation and takes the most logical course of action to actually successfully rescue Obi-Wan. Anakin was totally willing to do it, but he was probably, tired of getting in trouble with the Order, but hey, he was told to protect Padme at all costs, and if that includes rescuing Obi-Wan, so be it. But overall, like I said, I don't mind a good chunk of the film. It's just that romance could have been portrayed so much better and so much more in a way that I felt, I would feel like it would understand why these two characters get together. Clone Wars did a way better job at that, as I already said. But that's pretty much what I'm going to say. Not too much about each individual plot elements as a whole, but there's many great small moments here and there that I won't get into because I'm going to be giving you guys my review for Star Wars Episode 3, Revenge of the Sith. Let's just talk about Revenge of the Sith. And this is considered by most Star Wars fans to be the best prequel trilogy film, and I do have to concur. It shows the final days of the Republic before it finally transitions into the Galactic Empire. Though there is actually a line from Padme where she talks about which Anakin basically, does the Republic that they serve even exist? And I kind of wish that was brought up more, they explored that more. But they kind of definitely use that though to set up that Anakin is very much, he does not think critically about politics, which I think helps contribute to why he was so easily manipulated by Darth Sidious as Chancellor Palpatine. And it does actually make me wish a bigger part of the Clone Wars show, which, mind you, is a great show, did focus on how the Republic was, well before the time of this film, already the Empire in all but name only. They definitely hinted at that, but a political thriller, and all that. But that's besides the point. But I do want to say, just imagine a Clone Wars political thriller in the style of Star Wars Andor. I think that'd be really, really good. But getting back to the movie itself, and I think this does a really good job at showing the final thing that broke the illusion of democracy that Palpatine had created and maintained. I think it does that very good. And also, I think does a good job at showing an already man on the precipice of being the bad guy, becoming the bad guy. The problem is I don't think Episode 2 set that up as well as they could have. And there's a few other things kind of related to how I don't think the first two films of the prequel trilogy set up Anakin becoming the bad guy, besides that, he's going to become the bad guy. He's going to become Darth Vader. Not enough of that was set up in the previous two films to make it succinct here and make it also feel like the betrayal it is. Because, one, all of us Star Wars fans knew it was coming. There was no doubt about that. We knew it was coming. But at the same time, because we all knew that it was coming, they treated it not like they... Probably how I want to say it is they treated it like, it's going to happen, therefore we're going to obviously foreshadow it. So we knew it was coming, but instead of treating it like, say, the bomb is going to explode, but you don't know when. We knew by the end of this film it was going to happen, so we had even no suspense in when it was going to happen. In some ways, it would have been kind of interesting if they had it set up so that way maybe it happened really early in the film. That would have shocked us. That would have been much more, I think, much better if they wanted to do some more twists. But that's really beside the point and minute stuff on how maybe the story could have been told differently. But like I said, I think it does a really good job overall with the story it wanted to tell and the story it had to tell based off of what was set up before. I also gotta say, I can't believe it took until the last film that he thought he was ever going to make for for George Lucas, or Star Wars film for him to make, that George Lucas decided, oh yeah, I'm going to do a cameo in one of my own films. Took him to this film to actually do it. And he does do it, by the way. There's also some other things here and there. I've actually done a whole video on Padme's line about "This is how liberty dies with thunderous applause," which is become more and more relevant in today's world, so go check that out as well. But that's actually part of the reason why a lot of the Prequel episodes in Star Wars, The Clone Wars, I really liked, Andor, is because it does have something to say about the rise of authoritarianism, the rise of tyranny and fascism, and how, to combat it, how to deal with it, any other descriptive words we want to choose to say. So I kind of wish we got that a little bit more in the lead up to this film, like a one-off season of a TV show. I want to see that, Disney. Don't be cowards, do it. Disney's gonna be cowards, I know them. But that's a lot of stuff to say. I like this film. I think it does a good job. I do think it is the best film in the prequel trilogy. Though I also have to say as well, that I think it does, excellently show Palpatine's manipulation. Because in the previous episodes, he manipulated Padme into doing a no-confidence vote in Chancellor Rome. Then he, via Master Media, manipulated Jar Jar into getting him emergency powers. But here, it's showing him his manipulations not just on Anakin, but the Republic as a whole and the entirety of the Senate. And that I really like. And that's something I really like seeing in the Clone Wars as well. And then we can just talk about the great sound design, great music. We can talk about that all we want about Star Wars, because that's almost always true. Star Wars has always done great with sound design and music. And I also got to say, for General Grievous being a coward, once his MAGA guards are taken down, he doesn't let the droid army deal with Obi-Wan Kenobi. He does it himself. So he's a coward, but he does have a little bit in him. He's not a total coward, if you will. Well, he probably thought, maybe this time I'll get him. Because that's also what the Jedi Council was thinking when they sent Obi-Wan to defeat Grievous. Maybe this time he'll get him. Well, it worked out this time for the Jedi's favor. Kind of, because Order 66. And there's a lot of ways we can look at Order 66. But the way I like looking at it is the culmination of not only Palpatine's plan, but also, I'm pretty sure, while not addressed, there's been other groups that the Republic has been targeting in some ways, and the targeting the Jedi is the last thing. There's a famous poem from pre-Nazi Germany that goes something along the lines, first they came for the communists and I did not speak out for I was not a communist. Then they came for the socialists and I did not speak out for I was not a socialist. And it goes on for there. And then they came for the Jews and I did not speak out for I was not a Jew. And then, I forget if there was a few more groups, but and then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak out for me. I wonder if something like that was going on, and if we viewed Order 66 as a combination of that process of no one speaking out, that would make it even more tragic. I don't think it was, I don't think that's the intention of the creators, but I think it would be very interesting if they went that route. But suffice to say, tyranny reigns in the galaxy. Same if I've already watched the original trilogy, and you can go check out my reviews of it, so we know tyranny and fascism will be defeated. So now that we took a look at each individual of the prequel films, let's take a look at them as a collective unit. So first, I want to just address the fact that the prequels were not very well received upon their initial theatrical release, but they have come to become a very beloved part of the Star Wars fandom. Part of that can be attributed to those fans who were young children, teenagers, young adults when those films came out, are now the main bulk of the Star Wars films, especially the main bulk of Star Wars fans in the online communities. So nostalgia has played a role with it, and some of them may not be looking back at them with as critical of an eye, and some may be, and realizing, hey, these are not as bad as we saw, because that will happen as well. So I do want to address that, and I will say, the prequels, not as well done as the originals, which makes sense in some ways, but it doesn't. And I think I should elaborate on that some. they're definitely better in many ways in terms of production and all that, from a filmmaking standpoint, except for some of the CGI doesn't hold up that well, but a lot of the other stuff I think does well pretty good. But the prequel suffer, I think, in two ways. Is they had to be prequels and writing. And that's because being prequels, we know where everything is going to lead, so there's a lot of suspense taken out of it. And therefore suspense should have been, I think, better created through the sense of, we know this is going to happen, but when is it going to happen? And that could have created a whole different type of suspense. And George Lucas is not the best at writing character dialogue. His best films are the ones where he has people working with him who can help polish up the dialogue and make it, actually be able to be spoken. Because you can write it, but you can't always speak it. I'm kind of paraphrasing Harrison Ford there. But that is something we got to acknowledge about the prequels. In terms of dialogue writing, not so great. But world building, George Lucas does a great job on world building, and he, I think, has created a very great world with the prequels. There's a reason why people love the Clone Wars. It is because it took those world building elements and expanded on them and presented them in oftentimes much more interesting ways than they were originally presented, if they were presented at all properly in the way the audience would pick up on it in the prequel trilogy. But for all that said, we can talk more about audiences' reaction to things, how things were made, but let's actually talk about the story as a whole. The story is basically Anakin's fall to the dark side, and for the most part, I think that's told pretty well. The Phantom Menace introduces us to Anakin, we learn a little bit about him. Then in Episode 2, Attack of the Clones, we get to see, he doesn't have things quite all together. Then in the last film, it's like, oh crap, he doesn't have things all together, now he's a Sith Lord. And that all works pretty well, but there's a few things along the way I feel like could have been better polished, better streamlined and all that. One thing is I kind of wish Anakin was maybe a year or two older in the Phantom Menace, and maybe show more of his darker side and all that, because remember, he's presented, except for getting into one fight with Greedo, he's presented in a very positive light in the prequels, or I should say, more accurately, in the Phantom Menace. Perhaps maybe some streamlining, or maybe maybe a different interaction here or there could show that, yes, there's a darkness underneath. And then I think that would lead into what we are shown in the Attack of the Clones a lot better. Though still, please, keep that shadow where for a moment Anakin's shadow turns into Darth Vader's shadow. Keep that. That is spot on. Very well done. Show, don't tell. Remember, that's a showing thing. But you still got to tell the story. You can't just rely on background elements to show it to the audience. And with a few changes there, I think also maybe a few other streamlined changes here, like, especially in Attack of the Clones, show us maybe the most dark side, but also show that, hey, maybe if he wasn't manipulated, he definitely would be a much better person. I feel like that could have been portrayed a lot better because, again, why does Padme get with him? He admits to basically committing a genocide. Yes, he tries to justify it basically as a crime of passion, but it's still genocide. He slaughtered the Tuscans, the Sand People. Anyhow, I could go on and on about how I'm frustrated with that, and I wish that was presented a lot better, and I did it already go on a little bit earlier, so we'll talk about some other things as well. And that's mainly because I want to convey that despite my faults with a lot of the prequels, I still very much enjoy them. But a lot of that enjoyment is because of what was accomplished in Star Wars: The Clone Wars in its theatrical release, despite limited release for that beginning movie, which was originally 4 episodes of the show, by the way. And also with the subsequent 5, then 6, then 7 seasons of the show, help flesh out a lot of the stuff in the prequels in a way that make things make more sense. And that's a fault on the prequels, not on the Clone Wars. I'll talk about the Clone Wars in a future video, but at this point I think it's time to open up the discussion. The comment section is down below. I would love to hear your thoughts. Welcome to the Jedi Ranger. I'm JohnBerry555, and today I'm going to be reviewing Solo, a Star Wars story. So I have watched and reviewed Solo before on this YouTube channel, but since I'm rewatching all the Star Wars films, I figured might as well also rewatch this one as well. So it makes some good sense. And I'm doing this before I do the prequel films because I'm going to do the Clone Wars animated film because it technically did get a theatrical release after the prequel trilogy but before the sequel trilogy. But let's actually talk about Solo: A Star Wars Story. This is actually, of the Disney Star Wars films, the only one that came out in May, and it's the one that came out on the tail end of The Last Jedi, which sadly I do think led to its performance in the box office not being that great, because as I think most of us remember, The Last Jedi was a fairly divisive story. I loved it, but that doesn't negate the fact that the fandom's opinion on that film was divided. And most people, I feel like they sleep on Solo. Now, I will say, story-wise, of the Disney Star Wars films, it's actually probably my least favorite story, but that doesn't make it a bad story. And we also should address that because it being a prequel, many of the characters are played by different actors. Alden Aldrich, I can never get his name, but he played Han Solo, and he did, I would say, a pretty good job playing a young Han Solo. And there's actually one scene where, for a split second, I was like, that sounded just like Harrison Ford. In that moment, he did such a good job there. Donald Glover did an amazing Lando. All the actors did really good. And because those are the only two returning actors. Yes, we could talk about Chewbacca as well, since Peter Mayhew is no longer paying Chewbacca, and Giannis Sutanama, I hope I pronounced his name correctly, is doing that now. But Chewbacca's acting is always in body language, which is really part of really just doing any acting as a whole. But Chewbacca, because of it's a team effort between the physical actor who's in the suit, and then the sound team who selects what sounds to use to help convey emotion. It's a team effort, while with Donald Glover and with Alden Ehrenreich, they have to play their characters both by language and in the voice. The only team effort they get is from the directing of the cast members, playing off of the other cast members, from the costume design. So storytelling is always a team effort, but when somebody's basically is doing both the voice and body work of a character, you typically talk about them a bit more because their face is there. That's just how things are. But they all did a good job, all the actors as well. I actually would have to say my biggest complaint about the film has to do with Han's love arc in it with Kira, played by Emilia Clarke. And the reason why is because I'm sold on their childhood romance, but I'm not sold on like heartbreak or why things fell apart. I understand why intellectually, but the story doesn't quite sell it on me. Like, when you watch the story, especially near the end, like, okay, yeah, she's fighting with Han against Crimson Dawn. But then, nope, at the very end, she stays with Crimson Dawn and doesn't make a escape. And that's the part I feel like could have been better somehow. I'm not quite sure how, but that's where I think my biggest problem with the film lies, is in that last moment between Han and Kira. I feel like it sells that they have feelings for each other perfectly, but it doesn't sell that why Kira chose to stay with Crimson Dawn. Now, granted, when Crimson Dawn is actually secretly led by a rogue Sith Lord and could force Joker across half the galaxy, yeah, that makes some sense. That rogue Sith Lord is Maul, by the way, in case you don't know. So it does make sense from that point, but in lead up to that point, I felt like it didn't work. Like the fake betrayal of Woody Harrelson's character, Beckett, I believe. That twist out there and all that, and then Han shooting him, all worked well in the story. But now with basically Kira staying with Crimson Dawn, that betrayal, that fake out, whatever term you want to use, something about it just did not land for me. But that could just be how maybe, like, I knew Introductory was coming because this is a rewatch, but I feel like it wasn't telegraphed in the narrative properly or subverted. No, they subvert the narrative properly, because if you're going to not telegraph something, it needs to properly subvert the narrative. Graphed too well, so it couldn't be subverted properly. And so to fix that, they would either need to tone down Han's naivete, therefore it would have been telegraphed properly and would have been expected, or they would have needed to lean up that it was going to be a surprise, not just for us, the audience, but for the characters in the story besides Han. I think Chewbacca, Becca, they expected, but not Han. And that just didn't work. Han was too naive in that regard. Yes, childhood puppy love, but I feel like some telegraphing, some choices of how they conveyed it could have been done better for the sake of better making it feel fulfilled in the story. But with that all said, overall, I think Solo does a really good job at telling its story, telling us Han Solo as who he came to be. Yes, it very much leaned into the scoundrel with a heart of gold route, or actually more like the good guy who's just stuck living a scoundrel, smuggler's lifestyle, because that's really all he has available to him at this time. But I honestly love more how in the original trilogy and in the sequels as well, they lean more into the scoundrel with a heart of gold. Like, Han can't sit still. He eventually fell back into smuggling, something he knew he was comfortable with. So I prefer the heart of gold, scoundrel with a heart of gold, rather than good guy on hard times. I feel like that just fits Han's character better, though they do allude to that where he shoots Beckett first near the end of the film, so I think they did good there. That properly represented Han's character, and that was right around the same scene where I thought Alan did a really good job in. For a second, I thought I heard Harrison Ford in the performance. It wasn't, but it just did a good job in that moment there. And so many other good things as well in the film. Han winning the Millennium Falcon by not necessarily out-cheating Lando, but by preventing Lando from cheating. And I just love how Han throughout this is always confident. I really love how he always had that confidence. And that's actually part of the reason why I think his naivete about Kira basically not being able to get out of the lifestyle did not work for me, because he was so confident. His one thing he was only one thing he didn't work out. You can see why it didn't work. He needed either to be, really misled, but again, that's my only problem with the story besides one other. And this is not really a story problem, because I think it works fine in the story, but more of just how Star Wars always misses the mark whenever dealing with the topic of droid sentience and droid rights. Because R3, great character, I think some good stuff, like she could have been the John Brown of droid rights and all that, but in this film they play that for laughs. Even the most supportive character of R3, Lando, is still very much dismissive of her. And I feel like that hurts the film in a minor way. Not enough to make it a bad film, but enough to be like, did they consider the full implications of it? Imagine if we were watching a film in the lead up to the Civil War and the person who was fighting to end slavery was laughed at. Oh wait, some people actually make films like that. It's called Lost Cause propaganda. But that's kind of a side tangent there, but what I really wanted to convey is that I'm just frustrated how Star Wars always seems like they're about to say something about droid sentience and droid rights, and then takes it away and backtracks it on, or turns it into a joke. But that's more of a universe problem, a storytelling problem across the whole, and not anything with Solo specifically. So that's all I think I'll cover most of my thoughts about the film. I would love to hear your thoughts in the comment section down below. Welcome to the Jedi Ranger, I'm JohnBerry555, and this is my review of the Star Wars sequel trilogy. Episode 7, The Force Awakens, Episode 8, The Last Jedi, and Episode 9, The Rise of Skywalker. So we're going to take a look at each individual episode, and then we're going to take a look at the trilogy as a whole. Timestamps are down below if you would like to jump around. Welcome to the Jedi Ranger, I'm JohnBerry555, and today I'm going to be talking about Star Wars Episode 7, The Force Awakens. This is part of my series of reviews where I'm rewatching and reviewing every single live-action Star Wars film. I am actually going to touch on the Clone Wars animated film, but I decided when I'm going to do that, I'm going to talk about the rest of the Clone Wars series, so I made a change there. So I made a slight change there. But with The Force Awakens, this was the first Star Wars film that I saw in theaters, but it's also the only Disney film that it's also the only Disney-era Star Wars film I have not reviewed on my channel yet, so this is special in two regards. But yes, this film has a certain nostalgia for me because I got to see this in theaters, first time I ever got to see any Star Wars film in theaters, therefore it will hold a special place in my heart. That giddy feeling of watching The Crawl on the big screen for the very first time. There's just that experience of seeing it in the theater that I've not experienced with any of the Star Wars films that came out before it. And yes, I did get to experience that with the subsequent ones as well, but not to the same extent because there's something special about the first time. And I kind of wish I was doing YouTube when The Force Awakens came out, because then I could have had more an authentic reaction back then made for posterity. But unfortunately, I did not do that. But hey, I'm doing it now. I'm talking about the film now. Now, we also need to address the elephant in the room. That being, people hate the sequels. People also hated the prequels. I wonder, do people hate the originals too? Because that just seems like a common Star Wars fan thing to hate whatever the current Star Wars thing is. But yes, there is a lot of sequel hate, and I think a lot of it is unfounded. Now, I'll be talking about the other two sequel films later on when I talk about them individually, then when I do my sequel trilogy as a whole review. But specifically with The Force Awakens, I like it. I loved it. I think it was a great reintroduction to the Star Wars franchise. I also think it did a really good job at introducing us to our characters. Han is himself, which makes sense because, honestly, old Han Solo and old Indiana Jones seem like very much the same character. I guess that's the kind of character that Harrison Ford plays best nowadays, if I had to wager, I guess. But yeah, he's grumpy, but he also fills the place of the mentor for our new generation of heroes in this story. Basically the same position that Ben Kenobi had in A New Hope, and even Qui-Gon to a certain extent in The Phantom Menace. And like the mentor, he does not live to see the end of the film. I actually remember about a month or so after I saw The Force Awakens in theaters, I was at a lock-in for my church's youth group, and me and one of my friends there, we reenacted that scene. We just started doing it. No obvious communication. We just started doing it. I mean, having fun with Star Wars is a very important thing as well. And I brought this up because I mentioned Han Solo's death scene. But let's actually talk about that death scene because it's a very important scene, and it becomes even more important with The Rise of Skywalker. But in fact, this scene is presented in the film, so I'm not taking the rest of the sequels into context, but it's presented as the last chance for Ben Solo, for Kylo Ren to turn away from the dark side, and he rejects it. That's how the scene was read, I think, when the film was released, and I don't know if that was the intention of the filmmakers, but that's how it was read until later on with the additional context of The Last Jedi, and especially the final scene in The Force, in The Rise of Skywalker, where this scene is basically redone, but in brighter lighting, and Kylo Ren, Ben Solo, makes the correct choice that time. Which is a really great parallel, and I'll talk more about that when I talk about The Rise of Skywalker. But here in The Force Awakens, he's doubling down on the dark side. And I have this theory that Kylo Ben did not ignite the lightsaber, that Han did it, taking the choice away from his son because he knew his son couldn't make the choice. Which sounds weird, but one, Harrison Ford's been dying to come back to Star Wars only if they let him kill off Han Solo, and he finally succeeded. Plus, I'm sure the money helped as well. But with this scene in context of that and the characterization of Kylo couldn't make that decision. He was so torn between his family, the light side, and the First Order, the dark side, that he literally could not make a choice. So Han Solo made the choice for him to hopefully shock his son into realizing it was the wrong choice. I don't think it quite worked like he intended, but that's a father's love for his son, willing to do anything to try to save his son. In this case, his son from the dark side, not from death, but practically the same thing. Am I right? So there's that there. Also, we got Finn's characterization as well, which is very interesting as well. And that has to do a lot with the fact that he's kind of this film portrayed as a bit of a puppy dog. Basically, he latches on to Poe and Rey the minute he meets them, just like a puppy dog would when meeting someone they sense is a good person. And I don't think that's unintentional. I think that's definitely what they wanted to show. This is an individual who was kidnapped as a child and brainwashed to be the foot soldier of a fascist regime. And when he breaks it away, well, there's going to be some lingering effects, and that could be, a little overly trusting of people who aren't part of the First Order. But I do hate to say it that The Force Awakens was Finn's strongest point as a character in the sequel trilogy. I'll talk more about it, but I do think his introduction was the strongest part of it. And that's actually kind of true of all the films in the sequel trilogy. The Force Awakens is the strongest film because all they had to do was set up a story. They didn't need to conclude a story. They didn't need to finish it. And what does J.J. Abrams does best in his work? Setting things up. He's not the best finisher. That doesn't mean he can't do it. It just means that's not where his storytelling lies. I think I got thoughts about the Rise of Skywalker in that regard, and we'll get to that there. But I just want you to just hear that I think The Force Awakens is the strongest because it only had to set things up. It didn't have to worry about concluding. Therefore, a part 1 could be made super well. The problem is that you have creative disagreements, and that leads to fan disagreements because certain fans like certain interpretations and certain fans didn't like certain interpretations of characters and events and directions to take them. That's a lot to say, but I did need to get that addressed before continuing on to talk about the other characterizations. Leia's perfectly in character, not much for her because this is of the legacy characters Han Solo's film. That's the legacy character we get to see a bunch about. Leia is only secondary, and Luke is tertiary to all that. And Luke will get his spotlight in the next film, and Leia was supposed to get his spotlight in The Rise of Skywalker, which I'll talk about when I talk about The Rise of Skywalker. But there is that said, we got Kylo as well, who is basically a wannabe Vader fanboy. He's a Vader fanboy who wants to be just like Vader, but he's a bit of a dweeb, you could say. He's a bit of not really cut out for what he thinks he wants to do. I think that's a good way of saying it. Basically, Kylo Ren was never supposed to be this intimidating new Vader. He was always supposed to be a Vader wannabe, always in the shadow of Vader, which was the right choice in my opinion. Now, some Star Wars fans, I think, unfortunately missed that intention, but that's why I think the intention was behind Kylo. Like, we know we can't replicate Vader. We can't do that. Even though we're trying to replicate the feel of the original trilogy to a certain extent. But what if we made one of the main villains somebody who admires Vader, who wants to be like Vader, and thus is trying to be like Vader, but because he's not Vader, he's failing at it. I like that, and I think that was very well done in that regard. And that also brings us then to Rey, who is definitely this trilogy's version of Luke Skywalker, but she's different, but the same. Yes, Rey is just like Luke. She's starry-eyed and all that, but unlike Luke, she wants to stay on Jakku. Luke wanted to get off Tatooine. That's the only really fundamental difference between them as they were introduced. Both of them are introduced as good people who care, who want to do the right thing, but they are in different situations. Rey wants to stay on Jakku because she wants her family to come back, and she's afraid that if she leaves Jakku, her family will never find her. While Luke, he had his family. The only thing is that he wanted something more. He wanted something more than just being a moisture farmer. In a way, they both wanted what they didn't have, and that's where the characters fundamentally differ in terms of introduction, is what they have and what they want. Rey has adventure in her life already, but but she wants a family, so she wants to avoid adventure. Luke has a family and he wants adventure, but he also has this profound sense of responsibility to his family, therefore he's not going to go on an adventure quite yet. Rey, she's dragged into an adventure just like Luke, but it took her longer in her adventure to be, okay, I'm going to stop running from the adventure now. And running from adventure is something that both Finn and Rey are doing in this film. They're running away from their call to action. They're the start of the hero's journey, if you will. And by the end of this film, Rey has fully accepted it, and I think Finn's as well, but we'll talk more about Finn's call to action in that and journey in the adventure in the Last Jedi. And so I think that leaves Poe Dameron, who we got some great scenes with and all that, but unfortunately I think he does kind of lack in character development here. He's just introduced as this hotshot hero of a pilot, and there's not really any character development there to it. But can I say I really do love how basically Finn and Rey interact, and then Finn and Poe interact. I think there's some great character dynamics there, and it's kind of unfortunate that it's not until the Rise of Skywalker that we got to see Rey and Poe interacting. That'd be like if, I don't know, Luke and Leia never interacted in The New Hope. Not quite the same, but it's the same principle of the matter. When two of your main three heroes don't interact, it's kind of a bit weird. One of my few problems with this film is that, and that's honestly a minor thing, because they eventually do rectify that, though that does take some time. So I think that covers most of what I have to say about this film, about the characters. Maybe I should address the fact that Starkiller is basically a Death Star 2.0, just bigger and badder. But I do think that very much fits into the authoritarian fascist MO. It's all about wounded weapons and shows of force. So, well, the Death Star didn't frighten people into behaving. What if we go bigger and destroy entire systems and destroy stars as we're powering the weapon to destroy systems? That is such, I think, a fascist and authoritarian mentality, in that, well, the smaller scale didn't work, so we have to go bigger. We got to show off more. And people who support such an ideology, that is, might makes right. That's how they would think. Also, if you ever get a chance to listen to General Hux's speech in German, do so, because if you compare it with a certain someone from 1930s Germany, Hux's speech and that person's speech sound the same to my English ears, and I don't think that was a coincidence, and that German voice actor knew what he was doing. He knew what he was doing, and that is the right parallel. Basically, think of this. The First Order is, what if the Nazis survived, went into exile in Argentina, and struck back? That's essentially what's going on. Or Antarctica. We can use whatever metaphor that we want from those conspiracy theories. But the point I do want to convey with that, though, is that this film does a good job at showing the First Order and the dangers they possess. The only problem with that is we don't get enough of the New Republic to give better context for why they are a thing. But I very much do like how they're portrayed basically as a terrorist organization, as a paramilitary organization without the real backing of any government or that, so, which I think makes them in some ways more dangerous than the Empire, because the Empire had to keep the veneer of civilization, not quite, the veneer of responsibility. No, basically they didn't. The Empire didn't want to tip their hand too soon, but the First Order had no problem tipping their hand as quickly as they could once they subverted and all that. Seriously, read Bloodlines, you get a hint at how the First Order was subverting the Republic way before this film was set. Resistance, you get a taste of that as well. There's more I can discuss there. I also want to address one more thing about Rey, her piloting abilities. One, she's a scavenger. She's been over ships. She knows how they're generally set up. Two, it's established when they were running to the Falcon that Rey wanted to take a different ship, a quad jumper, which tells me that she had flown a quad jumper before. And while she admits that she had never flown the Falcon because they had not flown for a long time, she knew the things that Uncle Plutt put on the Falcon that Han didn't know. So that means she probably did some maintenance work for him, trying to get some extra portions. I say this because people like to say Rey is a Mary Sue. And in my opinion, she is not. And if you call Rey a Mary Sue, you might as well call Anakin and Luke a Mary Sue as well. Because remember, in Star Wars, the Force is literal plot armor and plot convenience. It's a Force. Once something should happen, it will happen. You know, Anakin blowing up the Trade Federation droid control ship. There's no way a 9-year-old should have been able to do that, even with the Force. Luke destroying the Death Star by making an impossible shot. Yes, the Force was involved, explicitly involved in the text of the story. And I think that's the key thing, is that with Anakin, he's told to be the chosen one, so everything is waved off by the fans. With Luke, when he does something impressive, the text does a very good job at showing to us that the Force is the reason why those impossible things are accomplished. But with Rey, I think maybe the filmmakers thought the audience was smarter than we actually are. Because, yes, it's kind of obvious, like, in the duel between Ben, and, or I should say Kylo at this point, and Rey, he mentions the Force, she closes her eyes, centers herself, and then gets the upper end on him. That's her reaching into the Force? It seemed pretty obvious to me. I do want to address too with her fighting. I don't think it's supposed to be that posture fighting. It doesn't look that posture to me. And they do though establish in the film back on Jakku that Rey knows how to fight because of the type of environment that she grew up in. Just with a staff rather than a lightsaber, but still melee combat. So maybe not everything's one-to-one transferable, but enough where she could not die. And you know what? That's what happened until she tapped into the Force and tapped into the dark side of the Force to get the upper hand on Kylo, who had proper training. And also Finn probably had some melee training as well. Maybe not with the lightsaber, but still. While skills may not be 100% transferable, if you know what to do with one, you could probably figure out what to do with the other. Such as, don't hold the lightsaber blade by your hand. And with her piloting skills, well, one, she's been working scavenging ships all her life, so there's a good chance that she knows how things are set up and that she's seen very different cockpits. Maybe even a few YT-1300s as well. Who knows how many might have ended up in the service of the rebellion. But also we can assume too that she did work on the Falcon because she knew about the things Uncle Plutt installed. How would she knew that if she didn't do maintenance work on the Falcon for Uncle Plutt? And while she did say the Falcon hadn't flown in a while, just doing maintenance work on it means she's vaguely familiar with the systems. And because she originally wanted to take the quad jumper before it was destroyed, tells me she knew that craft as well and perhaps had even flown it. Because remember, she called the Falcon junk. Why does everyone keep calling the Falcon junk? I don't know. But by establishing that for us, the audience, that she saw the Falcon was junk and she wanted a different ship, that means she knew the other ship was likely flight-worthy, therefore she knew how to fly that ship. And in Star Wars, flying is treated like driving a car. If you can fly one thing, you can fly other things. And that's something I think we need to keep in mind as a fandom. So no, I don't think Rey is a Mary Sue. Is she gifted? Is she a prodigy in the Force? Yes. But remember, Star Wars has the Force, which is literal plot armor and plot convenience in Deus Ex Machina. If we're going to talk about Mary Sue's and all that, we got to acknowledge the Force and the role it plays in the franchise since the very first film. Thanks for coming to my TED Talk on that. I might actually cut that into its own separate video, separate from this whole review. But now I want to switch it up and ask you, what did you think of Star Wars The Force Awakens? Let me know your thoughts in the comment section down below. Welcome to the Jedi Ranger, I'm JohnBay555, and today I'm reviewing Star Wars The Last Jedi. Star Wars Episode 8 The Last Jedi, to be specific, as directed by Rian Johnson. Now, there's a couple things I would like to address before we get into the heart of my review. One, this is actually the first Star Wars film I ever reviewed on my channel, so if you want to go see my original review, please do so. But this is going to be an update review with, you know, the perspective of time and all that, and a rewatch, and yes, the context of the other films that have come out, and the other supporting stories as well, that were not necessarily available at the time when the film was released. Additionally, this film was a very controversial film. I myself enjoyed it. I like it. I actually like the entirety of the sequel trilogy. What does that make me? Well, to some people that makes me a shill, I guess. But the main thing is because Star Wars, while very great, and I love it. I love the universe, and there's a lot of interesting concepts. Is not and never has really intended to be high concept, and I think some people do forget that. That doesn't mean it can't be good, because it is good. And when you look at the sequel trilogy as a whole, this one is probably the most thematic, the most adventurous, the most risk-taking of the bunch, and probably the most interesting in terms of the story that they are telling. And even in terms of how they tell the story, I think perhaps might be the best. The thing is itself is the story has a lot of elements that don't seem intuitive on first look. While while The Force Awakens and The Rise of Skywalker are much more surface level on what's going on, and you can figure out the plot a lot easier, but in The Last Jedi, you gotta apply a little more critical analysis to understand what's going on. And to begin with that, I'm going to highlight Poe's mutiny, because I think that's a very good story element that encompasses a lot of the controversy and how things can be misinterpreted, especially if you have some preconceived notions or an agenda you're trying to support. So, to begin with, the film establishes early on, before we even are introduced to Holdo, that Poe is a bit reckless, that he's a bit of a risk taker. That's established very first thing. He disobeys Leia's orders. He idolizes Leia. Keep that in mind. He idolizes Leia. He disobeys her orders and presses on the attack, and the rebellion, I should say the resistance, loses their entire fleet of bombers, and he's rightfully dressed down for it by Leia. And that's actually paralleled later on in the film when Poe's about to sacrifice himself. Yes, he's saved by Rose, and we'll talk about that later, but Poe, recognizing the situation is unattainable, does what he didn't do in that scene in the beginning of the film. Very smart there, shows his character development, but his character development was essentially learning he couldn't be the hotshot pilot always risk-taking. He was learning to be a leader, not the hero. While still being a hero because you're leading a rebellion, a resistance against an authoritarian fascist regime, so you're going to be the hero by default anyhow. But the point is, leading heroes is different than being a hero, if that makes sense the way I explained it. With that context aside, Poe is in the wrong, but the problem is that the film, I don't think, conveys that well enough, or maybe it conveys it too well. The sad thing is, a lot of people I think seem to have hate Holdo because she was a woman or woke in her purple hair. Honestly, the thing is the film did not do a proper job showing us who we were supposed to support in the mutiny as the audience, but I think that was intentional because it was supposed to be messy. In real-life military situations, a mutiny reflects just as badly upon the commander as it does the mutineers. Part of the reason with the HMS Bounty, William Bligh wrote down what he was going to tell the Admiralty on his way back to London was because he didn't want to get into any trouble himself. And part of that was because, he had his own crew to think about, but he also was tried to protect the people who stayed loyal during the mutiny. Mutinies by their nature are messy and complex, and I think that's no different here. And I think Rian Johnson did convey that proper tone, that mutinies are complex and all that, but Holdo could have handled the situation better at the same time. I think all she needed to do was bring Poe off to the side and tell him, hey, I know you're a go-getter, you need to take some you like taking action, but we're going to try to keep this plan, what we're going to do, on a need-to-know basis, so that way, in case there's any leaks, because the Force Order Tractor somehow, nothing can accidentally get leaked out. And then that would then provide additional motivation for Poe not to tell Holdo anything about him and Finn's and Rose's plan to do that canter bite jaunt. It would feed into that. I've actually talked about this before as well, but what I'm conveying here is that both characters make mistakes. And Poe's mistake was basically being reckless and not understanding the situation and just basically being the hero, who takes action and not the hero who leads. For lack of a better term, he's a Robin, not a Batman. Not the best analogy, I'll admit, but it's what I came up with on the spot. But Hodor also could have handled the situation better. Poe was already demoted for being reckless. She should have recognized that he was going to be a loose cannon, that he could do something reckless, and that could jeopardize the resistance. And she should have taken action to ease his concerns, ease his worry. But she didn't, and that's on her. And I do want to mention that Poe wasn't in the mutiny alone. Lieutenant Connix, who played by Carrie Fisher's real-life daughter, by the way, but who was promoted for efforts in-universe, promoted for efforts for helping evacuate the Dakar resistance base. Several other pilots and crew members. So Hodor's keeping things close was affecting more than just Poe. If Poe just came up to a bunch of people and say, hey, what about mutiny? It may not have gone well, but there was already discontent in the ranks. And that's why a mutiny that has basically Moses like true conspirators looks badly on the leader, because Hodor just did not recognize the mutiny forming among her ranks and that. So, you notice how, two things, when Leia came in, Poe was like, okay, I'm done. And when he had the plan explained to him, he was like, oh yeah, that's a good plan. He just needed to be given he didn't have to hold the whole plan, but enough to put his worries at ease. Because remember, the Resistance is not really a professional military. Poe should have known better being in the New Republic Navy at one point, but that's besides the point. The point being is that both of the characters should have learned something. And the narrative only has Poe learn something, mind you. But all that to say is, I actually like it because I like how it's messy. And even if Hodor has gotta keep things on a need-to-know basis for security, that still could have led to a mutiny as well. Lots going on there, but what I want to say is, I think this scene, that whole story arc, accompanies everything that people liked and hated about The Last Jedi. Last Jedi was a divisive film, but it was also a film you could easily debate on, like what characters made the right decisions and when. There's so much interesting stuff going on there that we could debate about. I've spent, I think, about 6 minutes talking about just one plot element, and there's more. You have the whole stuff with Luke and Rey. Luke's disconnected off himself from the Force, which is important context, mind you, which I'm kind of glazing over, but he still imparts Rey some important lessons, but he himself still gets a lesson from Yoda's Force Ghost at the end. A couple important lessons, mind you, but the biggest one being, basically, masters must learn that all pupils will grow beyond them. And then Yoda sets fire to the ancient Jedi text that Luke had been wanting to do since the start of the film, that he just never did because his own self-doubts and insecurities. But don't worry, Rey already took them, as we find out at the end. Also, this is kind of side the point, but I just love how after that, it just leaves us with Force Ghost Yoda and Luke just enjoying the fire, having a bonfire. Like, okay, where are the s'mores, guys? Come on, if you're having a bonfire, you gotta do that. And I think that was just a good way of ending Luke's arc before his end. He basically needed to relearn to be the hero everyone else saw him as. Not necessarily to live up the legend that is Luke Skywalker, but to help live what people expect and what he really is, and then inspire future people. Because what's the true hero? The hero who takes action, or the hero who helps inspire others? And that's what the scene at the end with Broom Boy was intended to represent. That Luke's legend is inspiring other people in the galaxy, people to stand up against the First Order. There's a reason why also at the end, when Rey asks Leia how they're going to rebuild all this, Leia says we have everything that they need. And yes, they have everything that they need. People to inspire hope in others to keep the fight going. I forget which character said it, but a line that they will be the spark that lights the rebellion against the First Order. which is exactly what they are. They are the spark. They are the kindling. They can't do it alone, and we will see that in The Last Jedi. With all The Last Jedi's pacing issues, that's something you can't fault them for. They kept that theme going of the survivors in this film being the spark that lights the rebellion against the First Order. And then we have everything with Canto Bight, which is just basically a rich people are in it for the money, don't trust them. And that's also kind of arc with DJ as well. Like, he's in it for the money. He's not in there for any ideological reasons. He may help you for a time, but don't give him your complete trust. Which is, I think, a very radical message. It's basically saying, eat the rich, without saying, eat the rich. Also true, while not related to Canto Bight and that stuff directly, when they snuck aboard the First Order's Dreadnought, the Supremacy I should say, just that shot of the laundry room with the iron being framed like a spaceship, that is just perfect. Now, I've said a lot, and there's a lot more we can talk about, such as Crate being a salt planet, and yes, there's a scene where one of the resistance soldiers puts his finger to it and tastes it in salt. By the way, one of those two soldiers in the scene is actually Gareth Edwards, if I remember correctly. But the real point, I think, of Crate being a salt planet, which I think is kind of interesting, is salt is very important for life, believe it or not. We need salt to survive, but too much of it is also a bad thing. In some ways, it's kind of fitting that the final confrontation between the First Order and Resistance is on a salt planet. Salt is necessary for life, but at the same time, it prevents stuff from growing. So it's symbolic on multiple fronts. The Resistance gets enough salt to continue, but at the same time, if they didn't, they would drown in the salt and not be able to grow into the rebellion that they will become. But because they won the battle, they lost strategically and tactically, but they won strategically because they accomplished their goals, holding out long enough and making their escape. That's a strategic win, even though they lost tactically. So, for the First Order though, because they lost strategically, they were salted. They were unable to grow, and the Resistance now can grow because they got the salt they need. I know, my metaphor is kind of clumsy, but I know that was intentional, but I think that's a very interesting read that I think warrants some future discussion. And of course, we're going to have a whole swirl of discussion in the comment section. Please, I like talking with you guys down there. But I bring that stuff up to show that this film is really well made. While I think I personally prefer The Rise of Skywalker a bit more, I think it's a bit stronger. That's only because I'm looking in the context of the story as a whole, and The Last Jedi, to understand the story, it's being told in relationship to the Force Awakens, not The Rise of Skywalker. Lots of thes in this trilogy, I've noticed. But regardless of that, The Last Jedi is much more hard to interpret because it can be interpreted in so many different ways. Like, that scene with the salt, I didn't even think about it until I was out there recording this video. I didn't plan on it. I like that. I'm going to put it in. And I did. And that's the nature of good film discussion and media criticism. You can have these rich, interesting conversations. Like, everything with Kylo is so interesting. Like, Rey thinks there's good in him, which, yeah, there's might. And Luke's force projection tells Leia that he can't save Ben, but Ben's not really gone, which I think is a wonderful scene. We know what's going to come because of The Rise of Skywalker, but I think that was a great way of having it in the movie to be, well, maybe he can be saved, maybe he can't be, but he's not being saved right now from the darkness. So, Luke goes to distract him instead, and distractions have been gnawing at Kylo Ren all this film. We can talk about everything with Rey trying to save him and them fighting together, and Rey being extended a hand by Kylo multiple times till she finally closes the door on him when she closes the Falcon's ramp. Very well done, in my opinion. Great symbolism and use of the set to help convey the story as well. But beyond that, ever since he killed Snoke, Ren now has to fight to lead the First Order. Yes, he uses the Force and Fear to inspire loyalty, but the thing is that when presented with a distraction, he's distracted from his duties as leader of the First Order. He's so focused on getting revenge on Luke, he doesn't realize the Resistance is going to get away to live to fight another day. And just that whole scene there's so many subtle hints that Luke is not really there, but at the same time it's not intuitive at first because we're introduced to him speaking with his sister, and he interacts with C-3PO, a droid. So that either proves that the Force is so strong he can make mechanical things see, or droids are sentient and can access the Force if they are sentient enough, which I think is a more interesting interpretation. Yes, Skippy the Jedi droid from Legends is a bit wonky, but in principle, not necessarily opposed to it depending on how a story goes. But all that was just to show us the audience that Luke was there and people could see him. It wasn't just a Leia thing. That's, I think, the key there. And then he goes and the fight is so amazing, but he avoids being touched by Kylo, whether in person, by lightsaber, it doesn't matter. And he's not even moving the sword when he's doing it, unlike Kylo. And it shows that showed to us the audience that Luke is not there. And then when Ren discovers it, Luke is like, "See you around, kid," and vanishes, and then he becomes one with the Force and all that. But I bring that up to show that it's just really well done, lots of good symbolisms, and I think a good way of pointing it is that Rian Johnson knew how to exploit a character's flaws to advance the story in a way that J.J. Abrams wasn't as good for. Abrams, perfect at setting up stories, but when we'll get to The Rise of Skywalker, we'll talk about how he's not maybe the best at finishing stories, which a lot of people I know do agree with. But there's more I can talk about, like, throughout The Last Jedi, Hux is made fun of. There's the whole thing where Poe trying to basically make fun of him, or should I say, undermine him during the transmission at the beginning while Poe was stalling for time. Yes, that's what he was doing for, but he was also trying to undermine Hux's leadership among the First Order. And then Ren just totally undermines Hux's leadership after Snoke is killed. Which, by the way, I think it was very interesting in the moment to kill Snoke, but I don't know if that was the best decision as a whole given what they decided to do in The Rise of Skywalker, but I don't necessarily hate it. It's just, was that the best choice for the story that they might have been thinking of telling at the time? Lots of interesting stuff, a lot of stuff to go through. But I think I'm going to end my review here. I've spoken for about 18-19 minutes now, and I want to keep the discussion going in the comment section, so let me know your thoughts down there. I also, and probably after I do my review for The Rise of Skywalker, I have another video about what I would have done if I was in charge of the sequel trilogy. While still keeping things mostly the same, we'll find out in about a week or two for that. But in the meantime, let me know your thoughts in the comment section down below. Welcome to the Jedi Ranger, I'm JohnBerry555, and it's time to take a look at probably the most controversial Star Wars film ever, or at least the most critically panned film by the Star Wars fandom. It was actually critically mixed by actual professional critics. Let's talk about Star Wars Episode 9, The Rise of Skywalker. And the first thing we should address is, I'm not that harsh on this film because I understand they had some extreme challenges going into it. One, a rushed development due to a change in directors and all that, so that meant they didn't have as much time to actually tell the story that they wanted. Two, Carrie Fisher's passing meant that probably the role they really wanted to give her did not end up happening. And three, and probably the biggest one, Star Wars fans are insufferable, just like Star Trek fans. Both fandoms are very demanding and very critical of all new stuff. And that makes things really, really hard because you gotta appease fans, but you also gotta make sure it's accessible to the general audience, and the general audience will also like it, yada, yada, yada. All that to say, I'm a bit soft on this film. And the thing is, the film's not bad. It's not the worst thing ever. You know, you don't have the the relationship between Anakin and Padme in Attack of the Clones, which, is it supposed to be toxic or is it supposed to be lovely? It can't be both in the way they portrayed it. It can't be both if they portrayed it differently. What I'm saying is that they tried to have it both ways and they failed. Here, don't have that problem. Yes, okay, bit weird with Rey and Ben kissing at the end, but like, okay, whatever. High emotions, you know how things can get at times. But that actually brings up what I want to talk about first. Kylo Ren / Ben Solo's arc. As I understand, the original treatment for Episode 9 that entitled Duel of the Fates was the idea that Ben was going to end up being full-on Kylo Ren, full-on in the dark side. That's not the way they went with redemption for him. And I think maybe they could have planned it ever so slightly better, communicated it a little bit better, but I do like it because it is different than Anakin's. Anakin's redeemed because it's like, oh yeah, I shouldn't let the Emperor, shouldn't let the bad guy kill my son. Meanwhile, Ben was like always being tugged on the light side, always tugged to do the right thing. He was just basically being a rebellious teen, even though by this point in the story he's not a teen anymore. But that's still kind of where he is. He's lashing out. He's trying to live up to expectations, both light side and dark side expectations of him. And I think that causes a lot of his behavior, a lot of his stuff. Basically, he's being a Vader wannabe who doesn't really have it in his heart to actually be Vader or any dark sider. And that's why he could be redeemed. And why he could actually take action post-redemption to continue helping save the galaxy, making the right choices. Vader died to be redeemed. Same thing with Ben, but not quite the same. And with Ben's redemption, first, his mother reaches out to him in the Force, basically like, hey, I'm here, remember? And yes, that does give Rey the opportunity to stab him, but Rey also immediately heals him with the Force once she realizes what she's done. We'll talk about Rey's story in a moment. But by doing that, that's also showing him compassion too, that I don't think he thought he deserved. Both his mother reaching out to him and Rey healing him in that moment showed him compassion I don't think he thought he had deserved. But by experiencing that compassion, I think that helped cement his return to the light side. And then to visually communicate to us, the audience, but also in himself, the Force helped him resurrect his father's memory in his own mind, make it visual for all that. Han Solo's not really there. He's not. But his memory is there. No. When Ben says you're only a memory, Han responds, your memory. That is literally Ben's memory being manifested by the Force. That's how I interpret that scene. And in that moment, he makes the right choice to throw his lightsaber away instead of killing his father. He could have let that memory die. Remember, Kylo Ren did say, let the past die, kill it if you have to. And he could have killed that memory, but he didn't. He threw his lightsaber away. Yes, the memory vanishes, its physical manifestation, but it's still there. And then he goes eventually, helps Rey confront Palpatine, and then uses the Force to heal Rey. Which, by the way, did he think he could heal Rey? Or was he just connecting with the Force and healed Rey by incident? Interesting question I just posed, and I don't have an answer to it. But I kind of wish we did get maybe some more lines from him. But let's actually talk about Rey's character arc and her struggles. Rey, throughout this film, is basically afraid of the power within her. She feels like, from the beginning of the film, she feels like she can't properly connect to the Force and connect to the Jedi in the Force, and that creates doubts for her. And then she has moments where basically her anger unleashes and gets the better of her. And the two most important scenes of that film impacting her character story is when she accidentally releases foresighting when she thinks Chewbacca had been captured by the First Order, and she thought because of that she accidentally killed him. And then when she basically in her fight with Kylo stabs him, which is also a moment of anger. But both of those things, she immediately recognizes she made a mistake. And then she goes on to make the same mistake Luke does in exiling herself. And this is actually where Rey's story and Luke's story intersect in terms of the overarching story. Rey basically decides to exile herself, not being able to trust herself, just like Luke did. Because Luke tells her, I was wrong. And that was Luke's story in The Last Jedi, was he made a mistake in exiling himself and basically letting the pressure get to him, for lack of a better term. And Rey did the same thing here. And Rey gets the pep talk that she needed. The truth that her grandfather is Palpatine, and Luke's thing is basically, it doesn't matter. You can be whoever you want to be. And I bring that up because when she grabs the Wayfinder out of the Death Star's remains, she's confronted with a vision where the dark side version herself tells her, do not fear who you are, something like that. It's not embrace who you really are, because if she embraced who she really was, the dark side wouldn't be a problem for her, because that's not who she is. The dark side's trying to twist her with a positive self-affirmation, when you think about it. But she does admit to Luke's Force Ghost that she is afraid of herself, and Luke gives her the advice, very valuable advice, that the destiny of any Jedi is confronting their fear. And her ultimate fear is confronting basically what she learned to be the worst possible thing she could about her legacy, her family, that she's descended from the space devil himself, Emperor Palpatine Darth Sidious. And by confronting him, she confronts the darkness within her, and just like Yoda said in Empire Strikes Back, she used the Force for defense, not for attack, and that's what defeats Palpatine once and for all. And yeah, she's reflecting Palpatine's own darkness back at him, or lightning in this case, but I mean, Rapari could be playing a role in it. I mean, perhaps she might have picked it up somewhere. It's very possible. She did a lot of reading. There's 2 scenes of her looking through the ancient Jedi text, so she might have learned something here and there about Rapari. But basically the point is she's not using the Force to attack Palpatine. She's using the Force to defend herself from Palpatine, and Palpatine's own darkness backfires on him, defeating him once and for all. And that connects back with what Yoda said all the way in Empire Strikes Back. I said it before, but I'll say it again. A Jedi uses the Force for defense, never for attack. And that's how the dark side is finally defeated in this film. Of course, with that, we also should probably talk about Luke's little bit of a character arc here, where he basically imparts some advice to Rey, which I've already mentioned, and that's kind of minor stuff, just some good stuff reminding us who Luke is as a character and showing us that, yes, he learned what he needed to in The Last Jedi. And that's when he then, to cement that, he lifts up his X-Wing out of the waters on Act 2. He does what he said was impossible in The Empire Strikes Back, which, when I was watching that scene, I couldn't just help think, when Yoda says, and that is why you fail. Basically, in this moment, Luke believed in the Force. He had no doubts anymore. And yes, as a Force Ghost, he's now literally one with the Force, so of course that plays a role. But if we're ignoring the metaphysical aspect and looking at the character stuff, that scene is to show to us, the audience, that he finally has fully learned the lesson that Yoda was teaching him all the way back in The Empire Strikes Back. Did we need to see it? Not necessarily. Was it good to see it? I think yes. I know, if I remember correctly, there was some discourse that it should have been Rey lifting it. And yes, I think that would have worked fine in the story. But because they wanted to give Luke a bit bigger role than I think they originally intended, they needed to do something to make that role communicate to us, the audience, something. And communicating to us, the audience, that Luke is one with the Force now, and that any doubts he used to have about the Force, about himself, are all gone. That was a great thing to communicate, and I think that worked out well for the story. Of course, speaking of Luke and all that, we need to talk about Leia and the fact that her role in the story was and is limited, and I don't believe that was the intention. I believe the intention was that they wanted this film to be the Leia spotlight film because Han got spotlighted in The Force Awakens and Luke got spotlighted in The Last Jedi. But with Carrie Fisher's passing, they could not properly spotlight Leia in Episode 9. Now, I don't know how the original Episode 9 duo, the Fate script, would have handled it. And yes, I have read it. I don't think it would have been that well received. There's a lot of weird stuff. JoJo would have liked it, but I don't know if the general audiences would have liked it. But with that addressed, what they did, I think, to address Leia's character, I think, was as well done as they could have done it. For one, they made what limited footage they had left of Leia unused. They made, I think, pretty good use of that. Definitely they expanded Maz Kanata's role in the film to help impart some of the dialogue that they didn't have audio of Carrie Fisher saying. I also think, too, that Ben's redemption would have been very different. I don't think that Harrison Ford would have reappeared. I think it might have been Leia force projecting herself, and that's how she would have died. I think that was maybe the original intention, or what they might have done if Carrie Fisher had survived. Maybe not the original intention, because behind the scenes complications with scripts and directors and all that. But the point I really wanted to convey there is a lot of the stuff that I think that Maz, Luke, and Han told to Rey and Ben would have been told by Leia if Leia was able to be in the film like they intended. But I'm glad they did not do that much deep faking and all that. They had Carrie Fisher's daughter, Billy Lord, with a little bit of digital help to play a younger Princess Leia. That was perfectly fine there. I think they did a pretty good job in that regard. And like I said, that was minor. I think that worked out well. And the rest of the film, I think they handled it the best they could. And the last thing I want to address with that is I think it was smart of them to have Leia not pass into the Force until Ben passed into the Force, with both of them becoming one of the Force at the same time. I think that was very well done, and I think that was a great way of ending both of their characters. I also want to mention when she went to reach out to Ben, she had Han's medal in his hand that Maz later gave to Chewbacca. Now, Chewbacca getting a medal was in the original version of Episode 9 Duel of the Fates, but like a comic has showed that Wookiees basically don't value medals the way humans do. And I feel like in the original script, it would have been too much like, you're getting a medal because you did something awesome. While here, I think it should have been handled a little bit better, but my view of it is more of, this is Han's medal, Leia would have wanted you to have it. And that would have meant something to Chewbacca, I think, because it's not his medal, it's Han's medal, his best friend's medal, and that would have meant something to Chewbacca. I kind of wish that's kind of what Maz Kanata said, because that would have, I think, conveyed why this medal would have actually meant something to Chewbacca, when all the other Wookiees that addressed it previously in the expanded universe stated that Wookiees don't value medals the same way. A totem of his best friend, his found family, would have, I think, meant something to Chewbacca rather than a medal to his own bravery. Of course, with that said, we got a lot of other brave actions. The entire Resistance going, basically trying to take on the Final Order by themselves, with the only hope being if Lando and Chewie can rally support in the rest of the galaxy, which they do. And that's what I think is so great about all that, is because the Resistance, they're giving people something to follow, some guidance. In the real life, if you know what's going on in the United States, you know it's a mess right now. We have a rise of authoritarian fascism, decline of civil liberties, just decline of our democratic institutions, and there just does not seem to be any meaningful resistance to that. And people are looking for leadership. I know Galvin Newsom has lately been making headlines with, basically mocking Trump's approach on social media, which, fine, it's probably needed, but it's not what I would personally be looking in either. Honestly, my Governor Pritzker, I think, is doing better because, yeah, he's throwing jabs here and there, but he's also like, what can I do for the people of my state? That seems like a much better mentality. Have a record rather than just a social media train stuff. I'm just saying we could go into all that. But what it is that the resistance, they're not, for lack of a better term, leaders. Poe does not feel like a leader. Even though that is what he learned to be in The Last Jedi, just because you learned how to be a leader does not mean you feel like you are a leader. You have, really, the only people who are natural leaders, for lack of a better term, left in the resistance would have been Leia and Lando, really, because everyone else pretty much is dead. All the natural leaders of the previous generation that the average person in the galaxy would have looked up to as heroes to lead them. And the idea that these, even though everyone we see in the resistance to us are heroes and leaders in their own right, they don't feel like that. But they feel like they have to give the galaxy hope, and they're in a position to do something, so they should. They are providing that inspiration, that hope for people in a galaxy beset by authoritarianism, tyranny, and fascism. That is what's going on in the galaxy, and the resistance gives people hope for that. And basically by giving people hope, like, hey, we have a chance to strike back. And yes, in real life you won't have one clear-cut easy victory, but in Star Wars, because it's space fantasy or science fantasy, depending on which installment you're talking about, it can have that. You can have that one big victory, and that saves the galaxy. What's a beautiful cinematic thing is that after they defeat the Final Order's destroyers, guess what? Exegol is not dark and stormy and gloomy anymore. There's actually sunlight, starlight shining now. The curse of the dark side is being lifted, the curse of tyranny. Yes, maybe it's a bit corny in some ways to have, oh, you defeat the bad guy's empire totally falls, and nature starts returning. But the thing is, they did that actually in The Lion King as well. And while the instant may be a bit silly, such a thing can happen in real life. Wolves were reintroduced to Yellowstone National Park, and within like a decade, if not shorter, the nature was healing from the lack of wolves. You can have those almost apparent magical things actually occur in real life. It just won't be as instant as we like to show in TV, films, and movies. Of course, there's a lot more stuff to discuss about this film. We can talk about that Finn wanted to tell Rey something, which I guarantee you, it was he wanted to tell Rey that he saw he was Force sensitive. Every conversation after that, it kind of, except for the stuff with Poe, reinforces that. I don't know why he didn't tell Poe. Poe was basically acting like, Poe's acting jealous. He's afraid Finn's going to tell Rey that he loves Rey instead of that he loves him. Come on, Poe's totally jealous in that scene. That's what's going on with Poe there. All that. But it's clear, Finn wanted to tell Rey that he believed he was connected to the Force. And the rest of Finn's story does confirm that. He just never tells Rey, and I kind of wish we did get that moment. And I do hope in wherever the next Star Wars film is going to be that's set after the sequel trilogy, that it establishes that Finn is training to be a Jedi. But one of the LEGO specials did have that, so at least we get that, so that does indicate that is their intention. Also, I'm pretty sure Poe might also be Force sensitive just because of the light speed skipping and all that. Yes, everyone yells at him for it, but to accomplish that, I feel like you would have needed to be connected to the Force. And speaking of Poe, first of all, the scene where he turns on the flashlight holding it like a lightsaber, that was for a comedic moment, and I think he knew what he was doing there too. Plus, I remember some people making fun of that, but name one Star Wars fan who hasn't pretended a flashlight is a lightsaber. Name one Star Wars fan. Oh yeah, I could name a couple, but they call flashlights torches, so name one Star Wars fan that hasn't used a torch as a lightsaber. Okay, should I go through every language and every variation of lightsaber, flashlight and torch so that way I can cover bases so people don't be pedantic about that? Probably not. I don't need to do that. But also, posting with the having done spice running, I kind of wish they said that basically he had like a rebellious year before he joined the New Republic, not that he left, because this film made it sound like he left the New Republic, became spice running for a little bit, then joined the Resistance. Personally, I would have rather, like, he had a year where he didn't know what he was doing and ended up spice running before he joined the New Republic, Starfighter Corps and all that, then joined the Resistance. I kind of wish that's how they communicated that. And I think that's what the expanded universe is going to go. But I don't mind that he did stuff like that. No, it's okay if that happened in his backstory. Just the timeline does not quite work out with what was established in the films. The expanded universe can make it work a little bit nicer and all that. But probably the biggest thing I do want to discuss is that Hux is the spy. Hux is a spy not because he believes in democracy or that, it's because he hates Kylo Ren. He was going to shoot Kylo to make sure Kylo couldn't take the First Order from him in The Last Jedi. But he didn't because Kylo woke up in fear and all that. And I think with the Legion General Pride showing up and basically becoming the new number one officer, Kylo's right-hand man for commanding the First Order, I think that brought out some insecurities in Hux. And let's also remember, in the expanded universe, in Legends, backstabbing was common in the Empire, in the Sith Empire during the Old Republic. Hux is just continuing that tradition. He's helping the good guys because he thinks that's going to make he can get revenge on his enemies, and he doesn't care what happens to the First Order at that point because he's so fueled by his anger and hatred of Kylo Ren. Literally, in Legends at the very least, Darth Bane basically orchestrated the defeat of the Sith because he was tired of them infighting and killing each other and preventing the Sith from being able to win. Darkseid MO from the get-go. Thousands of examples probably exist in across Legends and canon. Maybe not thousands, but a good handful. Totally believable that basically a spoiled, privileged general who was a spoiled, privileged kid would have ended up betraying his organization because of spite. I believe it. There's always infighting in any organization, whether authoritarian or democratic. There's always going to be infighting, but the Empire, because of this, how the Sith are in Legends and canon, always encourage a climbing over the top of each other mentality, fighting for dominance, and that's going to spread to the underlings who are not Sith. And that's what Hux is doing. He's just continuing that idea. But I do want to say, Pride, he saw right through Hux. And Pride is, I think, much more intimidating villain than Hux. Mainly because Pride does not seem ruled by his emotions. He's a Sith loyalist, for lack of a better term. Like, basically, he's the kind of person that the Sith want under their control. Someone who's, yes, has a lot of pride, but is also loyal and won't do something stupid to betray you. Which is actually quite surprising that he lasted so long and got to such a high rank. But I say that because I want to convey to you guys that just because it may seem silly on paper doesn't mean it can't work within the story. Plus also, I do like how basically all the characters are like, no way, what? We don't believe you. Pretty much, and yeah, Poe jokes like, yeah, I knew it. And Finn is like, no, you didn't. And that's fine in my opinion. It's okay for things like that to occur. But I do kind of wish more characters like, why was it Hux? And also Palpatine returning. I know lots of people have problems with it, but one, it happened in Legends with the Dark Empire comic, so it's nothing new under the sun there. And two, in the film, when Poe says basically, I don't know how Palpatine returned, somehow Palpatine returned, that's because he literally doesn't know. And then the person who has done research into the Sith and all that, who by the way, wrote an in-universe book that's now an out-of-universe book, which I still need to finish reading. But I'll talk about that at some point. I gotta finish it, but it's a good read anyhow. But anyhow, he literally goes over the possibilities, which all of it ended up being true. cloning, dark science, secrets only the Sith knew, yada yada. But the point with that is that the Resistance does not know. They're not supposed to know. And the First Order and the Final Order, they're not going to question it. Palpatine is the boss. You know, they're not going to question it because they're his underlings. And Kylo, well, he doesn't kill because, like, I'll use Palpatine as far as he's useful. And that literally was Kylo's plan until he got redeemed. Use Palpatine as long as he was useful. And with that said, I could have talked more about that, but basically I'm saying there's nothing new under the sun, and of course the Resistance doesn't know. But it was bad that the Palpatine's message was done in fortnight. No, why did they do that? That was dumb and stupid. But now to address the final thing I would like to talk about. There's a lot more I could talk about the film, small moments here and there. I could have talked a lot more about Lando, and actually before I get to my final thoughts about that, let's actually talk about Lando. I think Lando was handled really well. I know the books and that have established that Lando was also looking for his daughter, that's why he joined Luke on the hunt for the Sith Wayfinder. It's all connected, also with Rey's parents and all that, who, by the way, Rey has some good parents. Read Shadows of the Sith covers that story a lot. But his scene at the end with Jaina, right? Yeah, I think so. Basically, it's not saying that she's his daughter. So while I don't think that scene establishes that Jaina is Lando's daughter, I do think it's showing that Jaina was in a similar situation to what happened to Lando's daughter. And that's going to create a bond for them. Also, can we please get the Calrissian Chronicles? I love the idea of have a present tense story where it's Billy D. Williams playing Lando, and then Lando and Jaina, they're going on an adventure, maybe trying to find Lando's daughter, Jaina's family, and helping other people who were conscripted as children to the First Order. Meanwhile, there's a past story that's going to be somehow connected, where Donald Glover was playing Lando, and we get that. Come on, please let's do that, Star Wars. It's been forever. Why have you done that? I think everyone would love that. Are you afraid because people did not really like the recasting of Han? No one complained about the recasting of Lando in Solo. Not to my knowledge. Please, get on that. But with that said, is The Rise of Skywalker the worst film? No. I still think that belongs to Attack the Clones. But is it the weakest film? Probably. It's definitely the weakest of the live-action saga films. It's definitely the weakest of the sequel trilogy, without a doubt. And actually probably the worst of the sequel trilogy. But I don't think it's a bad film. I think it was a rushed film. The fact that it turned out as well as it did, despite all its rushed development, despite the fact that casting not really casting changes, but losing one of the main actors, last minute director changes. There's so much that was going against this film. The fact that it wasn't a total train wreck and dumpster fire, in my opinion, is a miracle. The fact that it has a mostly coherent story with some pretty interesting ideas that could very much be, and hopefully will be if they have not already, expanded upon in books and other stories, is a testament to what I think is the fact that it's not a bad film. It's just a controversial film. And it's controversial because Star Wars fans have very high standards. And so yeah, The Last Jedi is a decent film. Is it the best? No. Could it have been better? Definitely. But it's not a dumpster fire like so many people thought it was. I encourage you, rewatch the film if you haven't done so already, and try not to put on your expectations in that. That's what I did going into this, because you might find that it's better than you remembered. Is it going to be the best? No. Could it have been improved? Certainly. But that does not necessarily make it a bad film. It doesn't make it a great film either. I would say it's probably middle of the road or that. But the fact is that it's a solid, okay film. I wouldn't call it no Oscar worthy except for in sound design. because Star Wars is always Oscar-worthy in its sound and music. Star Wars has never gone wrong in that department. But what I really wanted to convey with that is that be kinder to it. Don't hate it as much. Hate leads to anger. Anger leads to hate. Oh wait, I said it the other way around, but you know what I mean. Hating the film doesn't get you anything. It doesn't allow you to enjoy it. It just boils over. It makes you feel miserable. Finding what you love, finding what you enjoy is much better. And that's what I try to do with Star Wars. It's not what do I dislike about Star Wars, it's what do I like about it? What do I find interesting about it? And no, that is such a better mentality to go in. I believe it's the chain of cinema wins that famously says that every film has its lovers, or something to that sentiment. And I'm one of the lovers of The Rise of Skywalker. I love its little bit of a messiness. I love that it, had fun with the property. Yes, it could have been dark and serious, but it was dark, it was serious. But it also was hopeful. And I feel like the original Duel of the Fate script did not have that hope. At least that was how I felt after reading its leak. But with all that said, I want to hear your thoughts. The comment section is down below, so let's keep the discussion going. And I do mean a discussion. Please don't go into ad hominems and name callings and yada yada yada. Let's have an actual discussion about the merits of the film and what maybe it could have done better. And speaking of that, because I know we all would like to see it, next week is going to be my sequel trilogy review, of course. But either 1 or 2 weeks later, I'm going to put out a video where I am going to be giving you guys my take if I was in charge of the sequel trilogy. And you know what? I'm going to do the prequel trilogy as well. I'll lay the ground rules before I make those videos. I'll probably do prequels and sequels, and then do one where sequels based off the changes I made to the prequels. Something like that. I'll have an announcement video for that, and those videos will be made at least a day early to all channel members. But with that all said, I hope you stay tuned for that. If you have any thoughts on how you want me to present that series, let me know in the comment section. But do let me know what are your thoughts on The Rise of Skywalker. Let's keep the discussion going, and please, let's keep it civil. So now that we took a look at each individual film, let's take a look at the sequel trilogy as a whole. And to begin, we have to address the elephant in the room, which I've already discussed this about most of the films because the sequel trilogy sparked a lot of online controversy and arguments regarding are they good, are they not good, do they ruin characters, do they not ruin characters, are they lazy rip-offs of the OT, are they not lazy rip-offs. So much debate and discussion, but all of this really comes down to one major flaw with the sequel trilogy. And it's the only actual flaw I give Disney any actual criticisms for. And that is rushed development. Disney wanted to make their money back on Star Wars as quickly as possible. So they were like, okay, we bought it, 5 years, movie out. And actually I think it was 2012, I believe, when they bought it. And then 2015, so 3-year development, I think, if I got my timeline correct. Basically, they wanted to make the money back as soon as possible, and that meant a rush development. J.J. Abrams played it relatively safe with Episode 7, The Force Awakens. He does, I think, a pretty good job at introductions, not as good as conclusions, but he set up a story that could go in several different directions, and I think that's part of the reason why The Force Awakens is considered the least controversial of the sequel trilogy, because it played it relatively safe, but still introduced some pretty intriguing ideas that different directors could pull on, and I personally think Rian Johnson pulled on those threads in some pretty interesting ways. Now, would, if I was in charge, have concluded the same way J.J. Abrams did? Probably not, but that's besides the point. The point is that it was a rush develop. So, J.J. Abrams played it relatively safe, didn't go too crazy or that, just a pretty good solid that was going to be a good starting point for a new story. Rian Johnson took it in an interesting direction, and then Episode 9 happens where it was really rushed. Not just the trilogy was rushed as a whole with no real coherent plan to begin with, but they changed directors at the last minute due to creative differences. They brought J.J. Abrams back because Ryan wasn't interested, and we got the Rise of Skywalker, which I still think, for the rush job it was, isn't as bad as some people think. I think people were looking to be mad at it. I think it was just a rushed film that had some good ideas that just didn't get the time to properly figure out how they wanted to express those ideas. In other words, a fun film, just not a solid film. And fun does not necessarily mean the best made, but for rushed development, I think it could have been a lot worse and all that. But the main thing with this is that there was no coherent plan for the sequel trilogy. I think Disney only had one directive, is that they wanted Han to be spotlighted in one film, Luke to be spotlighted in another film, and Leia in another film. I think that was the only directive that Disney and maybe even Kathleen Kennedy gave for what they wanted to do with the sequel trilogy as a whole. No overarching themes they wanted to explore, nothing like that. So it was made as you go, which can work for a story. George Lucas did that himself with Star Wars, with the original trilogy. But one, you had one creative vision behind it, and two, even though he didn't have it fully planned out, he still had some things in mind if he got to continue the story, what he would want to tell, so he was able to set that stuff up. But the thing is it all comes down to you had that one creative person. Therefore, I think a develop as you go works better when you have that one creative vision. When you have different creative visions, you need a lot more cooperation and planning in order to figure out what you wanted to tell. So, basically, I'm going to do a whole video about if I was in charge of the sequel trilogy, but what I would say that they should have done is, if Disney wasn't being a greedy corporation, wait an additional 2 to 3 years, so that way they could get all the directors properly together to hammer out how they wanted to go about it and what they wanted to do with the trilogy as a whole. I don't think, like what some internet people say, I don't think they hated each other and that, but when you have directors with different creative visions and creative styles and different ideas on how they want to develop the story, you're going to get the impression that maybe there is going to be some disagreement between them. And there probably was. Creative disagreement. Not hating each other or hating the direction, more of, I kind of would have done it this way, and now that I'm back, I'm going to kind of go back to the way I was probably going to do it anyhow. Maybe, maybe not. But I rambled on about a lot of that, but I wanted to say that lack of, I would say, coordination and planning is where most of the sequel trilogy's problems are, and why some people find it disjointed. I myself, I don't find it that disjointed. I find it more of, you can definitely tell that The Last Jedi was made by a very different director than the other two films, and that stands out. But when thinking back on like the sequel trilogy, I'm sorry, not the sequel, the prequel trilogy, you can tell it's generally one guy, but you can definitely tell in one film he had a much more cohesive creative idea than the others. Yes, I'm saying George Lucas wasn't perfect. Star Wars fans have been like that ever since Disney sold Star Wars. Like, George Lucas did no wrong. Everything he made was golden. Thing is, he's a great creative visionary. Not the best director, to say the least. Not the best writer. Great for coming up story ideas, camera, like on the technical side of things and story planning, George Lucas does a good job. It's just everything else he's not necessarily the best at, and us Star Wars fans can't look back at George Lucas with rose-tinted glasses all the time. But that's enough about maybe more the behind-the-scenes stuff and how they should have definitely done more planning. Let's actually talk about as a whole. And I think the central theme message that was conveyed in the sequels, despite its disjointed nature, was the dangers of fascism coming back once you defeat the original fascists, basically. No, the rebels defeated the Empire, but Imperial sympathizers were still around and came back with revenge. That is a very, I think, important message that just because you defeat somebody on the field of battle doesn't mean you win the peace. That happened to the United States. The Union may have won the war, but the South won the peace, more or less. But like literally for a while, the idea of the lost cause was widespread in the United States beyond just the South in academia and schools. Wilson? Yeah, President Wilson was a we're not going to discuss about that. Go to the cipher if you want to hear about Wilson. He expresses it way better than I do in his problems. But anyhow, the thing is that, and many of the problems the United States are facing right now comes from the fact that the South won the peace. The slavers won the peace, which is scary. And yes, Germany did a good job after World War II in actually making sure Nazis didn't come back. But the thing is, that threat is always going to be there, because even if the sympathizers of the old or the proponents of the old aren't gone, you'll still have the people who they may have been right. And that causes a whole host of problems. And actually, we see both in the sequel trilogy. You have the Final Order, which you can say is the old guard. General Pride in The Rise of Skywalker is part of that old guard. And I think Captain, whatever his name, who commanded the Dreadnought, was also part of that old guard of Imperials. They stuck around and were able to influence it. But you have people like General Hux, that yes, he was raised by an Imperial, but General Hux, Kylo Ren, they could be symbolizing the people who are questioning, well, maybe they were right, and that causes issues. Now, granted, Star Wars is not always the best at this kind of stuff and expressing these allegories and can sometimes get muddled, but it's not just realize things are muddled all the time. But essentially, the sequel trilogy is about the threat of fascism, of authoritarianism, of tyranny coming back if the practitioners of the old order are still around to influence others. And that is a threat that many democracies in the West are feeling right now. Real life Democrat backsliding is a huge thing. My home country, the United States, is facing that very concept right now. We have a president who is threatening military deployment in blue cities and democratic cities because they're not bending the knee to him. Meanwhile, there are cities in red states or with red governors that have higher crime than the blue states and blue cities, and yet he's not talking about them. Suspicious, don't you think? And some of you may be like, why are you bringing politics into Star Wars? The thing is, Star Wars has always been political. Now, in this original trilogy, the politics were not necessarily in your face because, yeah, sure, you got the line about the Senate being dissolved, but the politics were not about the political process. And that, I think, what some people hate. And why some of the complaints that the prequels existed is because people didn't like the boring parts of politics, the procedural stuff, the stuff going on. But as things have been made clear, nowadays things are being made political because, female main character, gay character, and those are labeled as woke and political. And I'm like, guys, yes, it's political because you are making it political. It wouldn't be political if you didn't make it political. And I'm talking about the people who are complaining about it. And that's the thing I wanted to convey in this section of the review, is that the sequel trilogy is political because everything is political. Sometimes you may not know it's political because either one, you agree with it, or two, is because it's not as in your face. Rebels fighting an authoritarian government. No one is going to think of that as political, but that is inherently political, and that's the original trilogy. In the prequel trilogy, politics are much more overt because we are dealing with politics themselves. An executive consolidating power and declaring himself emperor. That is political, and that is much more overtly political because it is part of the plot itself, not the background, the set dressing for the actions. Now, we're doing it's a political process, not politics. And in the sequel trilogy, they actually muddled the politics. I actually did a whole video on that. Go check that out. But the politics were muddled because they were kind of wishy-washy, and they tried to have their cake and eat it too, and it came off muddled. It came off not very well conveyed. But it is inherently political and has that political message about the threat of authoritarianism, fascism, tyranny coming back to a galaxy, coming back to a society even after they've once defeated it. I can go on and on about that, but let's move on away from that kind of stuff and talk about what I saw to the sequel trilogy and did I enjoy it? And the answer is yes. I enjoyed the sequel trilogy. I enjoyed the ideas that were brought up. I enjoyed the different ways the books, comics, and shows, I should say, mostly Star Wars Resistance at this point, have expanded upon what was expressed in the sequels. Like, if you ever get a chance to read Star Wars Bloodlines, do so. It is a phenomenal book. It's a political thriller, too, mind you, as well. So if you hate politics, you may not like it, but it is a really good book, in my opinion, and is expressing what I think they were trying to get at about the politics in the sequel trilogy, but in a much more effective manner. Better expression. Books can do that because it's much easier to get character dialogues in their heads and that where they think about stuff that we can't get in film, especially in an action-adventure film like Star Wars. But there's a lot more too. Star Wars Resistance, yes, it may be a kid show, but it has some pretty intriguing storylines that I think are worth checking out if you haven't seen it. I reviewed that back when it was originally airing, so if you want to see my reviews, go for it. Though I will say, I probably would say different things now as I've progressed as a Star Wars fan and making these YouTube videos and reviews of Star Wars and even Star Trek and some of the other shows as well. And there's additional things we can discuss, but I think I want to open up the discussion. We have a comment section here on YouTube, so let's use it. I want to hear your thoughts on the Star Wars sequel trilogy. Do try to keep it civil, that's my only request. Now that I took a look at each individual Star Wars saga film for the Skywalker Saga, plus Rogue One and Solo because why not? What does the Skywalker Saga, what does Star Wars as a whole have to say? Because we're making a review, we're not just saying, I like it, and I do like Star Wars, mind you, there's a reason why I do this for fun. But what does Star Wars have to say? What is it trying to tell us, the audience? And especially with the Skywalker Saga, you have the story of basically one family and their impact on galactic history. But that's the plot. That's not what it's trying to tell us, the audience. Star Wars is at its core a story about fighting against tyranny and authoritarianism. The enemies are often either criminals seeking to inspire fear. That's going to be more of when we get into the more underworld stuff. But when you take a look at the series as a whole, let's see, you got the Jedi trying to stave off the dark side and the rise of the Sith in the prequel trilogy. They ultimately fail, but that is to set up the story that actually came first because the prequels were prequels, and we had to get in the story was how we got, or how the universe got to what we see in the original trilogy with rebels fighting against an authoritarian empire. And just those two alone, before I even talk about the sequels, is basically a warning about how a society falls into authoritarianism and tyranny, or should I say what it is, fascism, and then how a society throws it off. And then the final trilogy is all about where we throw off authoritarianism and tyranny and fascism off, but we still got to maintain that. They will come back if they can help it. There's always going to be those people seeking to rule, to oppress others, and that is an ongoing fight. And that is a very potent message. Even Star Trek doesn't necessarily do that message. Star Trek is almost always about how humanity can better itself in the current problems of humanity, but there's never really any story about fighting against homegrown authoritarianism and tyranny. Yes, there's a few episodes in Deep Space Nine, and I think maybe in Discovery and Picard, but ignoring those, because I just haven't seen Discovery or Picard, but like in every other show, like except with the exception of the odd rogue admiral, bad admiral, you don't really have an example of our heroes coming together to be like, hey, the Federation's falling to a dictator, we should probably do something about it. It's either always outside certain agitators or one rogue actor never having to deal with systemic problems. And believe it or not, systemic issues for our heroes to fight against in their own society is way more common in Star Wars. Because Star Wars is not about a hopeful future where we've overcome our problems. It's about a used past. The Star Wars, all the sci-fi films have begun with a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away. The Star Wars is a used, lived-in world. Things are not perfect. Things can always be improved. And because of that, what our heroes deal with in Star Wars is in some ways more real to real life. We live in a used world when you think about it. We lived in a world where there are people actively trying to take away our democracy and our liberties. In Star Trek, those are all outside threats, outside the Federation utopian society. So in some ways, it's not as real to the heroes. It's just an exterior threat that they have to make sure doesn't get into the society, not really coming from within. So I do appreciate that they try to do that a bit more in their storytelling, but this is a review about Star Wars, not Star Trek. And ultimately, that, and along with the fact that Star Wars is more escapism, even though the universe is more realistic in some regards, contributes to why I actually do think I enjoy Star Wars more than Star Trek, even though I love both franchises. And that's because I feel like with Star Wars, you can do more, you can tell more stories without undermining the core of Star Wars. Because the core of Star Wars is always good guys fighting bad guys, fighting for a better tomorrow. Not good guys trying to maintain a good society. Star Trek, despite being very progressive, very woke if you will, is ultimately a conservative show, but not conservative in the sense of they're trying to argue for, going back to things the way it were in our own real life societies. Our heroes are always fighting to protect the status quo of their world. That's conservatism when you really think about it. While Star Trek, our heroes are either fighting against the forces that are trying to regress society, or they're trying to improve society. And that is ultimately very different than Star Trek, which is all about how we've already overcome our problems. Let's go look at how our problems still exist in alien societies. Very different, and both very important for understanding humanity and human nature. And I probably put just now way more thought into Star Wars than George Lucas ever did. But I want to hear your thoughts. What do you think of Star Wars? Yes, I did some comparison with Star Trek, but because that's one of the other most popular sci-fi franchises out there, and if you're reviewing Star Wars, you have to compare it to something. And Star Trek, I think, is ultimately the best one. Could I compare it to Battlestar Galactica? Yes, especially if I'm talking about droids and AI and all that. Star Trek as well. Maybe Stargate as well would be some other good comparisons. But everyone knows Star Wars. Everyone knows Star Trek at a surface level. So it makes a good starting point for comparing the two universes and franchises, and understanding what each franchise is trying to do helps you understand the other ones. So with that said, I would love to hear your thoughts in the comment section down below. Thank you for watching my video. I do hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please be sure to give this video a like and share. Also, consider subscribing to my channel to stay up to date on all my latest content. In the meantime, thank you for watching, and as always, have a good day, a good night, wherever you are. May the Force be with you always.